And let me tell you about a cold night in November and a radar screen in northern Michigan and 2 points of light that touched each other and became one. There is something about Lake Superior in late November that does not feel like water. It feels like distance. If you have ever stood on its shore in that part of the year, you know what I mean. The lake does not lap. It does not sparkle. It moves in long, heavy swells the colour of gunmetal, and the horizon does not so much end as dissolve, because the sky and the water are the same shade of grey, and there is no honest line between them. The wind comes off the surface carrying a cold that is different from ordinary cold. It has weight to it. It goes through wool and through canvas and through the small gaps at your wrists, and it settles somewhere behind your ribs, and it stays there long after you've gone indoors. Superior is the largest freshwater lake on the surface of the earth by area. It holds roughly 3 quadrillion gallons of water. It is deep enough in places to swallow a 40-story building and leave no ripple at the surface to mark where it went. Its average temperature hovers just above freezing throughout most of the year, and at depth it stays near 39 degrees regardless of what the season is doing above it. The old sailors on the lake had a saying about that cold water. They said that Superior does not give up her dead. It was not poetry, it was physics. In water that cold, the bacteria that would ordinarily cause a body to rise never fully take hold. What sinks in Superior tends to stay down. Roughly 350 shipwrecks rest on the lake bottom. Some of them have never been found. 10,000 people are believed to have died on those waters across the centuries, and a great many of them are still there, in the dark, in the cold, held in a kind of preservation that is not quite peace. That is the body of water we're talking about tonight. That is what was underneath them. Now let me take you back. The year is 1953, and America is afraid in a very particular way. The Second World War has been over for 8 years, which sounds like a long time until you consider that most of the men flying interceptor aircraft in 1953 had personally been in that war. They were young then. They're only slightly less young now, and the enemy has changed shape entirely. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic device in 1949, 4 years earlier than most American analysts had predicted. That single event rearranged the psychological architecture of the entire country. Before it, the bomb was an American possession, a terrible thing, but a thing that belonged to us. After it, the bomb was a weather condition. It could come from anywhere, and crucially, the shortest path from Soviet airfields to American cities did not run across the Atlantic, where the Navy waited. It ran over the top of the world, over the pole, over the Arctic ice, down through Canada, and into the northern United States, across exactly the kind of empty, freezing, sparsely populated terrain that surrounds Lake Superior. If you unroll a standard map, this makes very little sense. But maps lie about the top of the globe. If you take a physical globe and stretch a string from Moscow to Chicago, the string runs over the polar cap and comes down through Hudson Bay, across Ontario and into the Great Lakes. That string passes almost directly over the water where Felix Moncla disappeared. The Air Force understood this, and so, through the early 1950s, the northern border of the United States was becoming one of the most heavily instrumented spaces on Earth. Radar stations went up across the Great Lakes region, along the Canadian frontier, and eventually far into the Arctic itself. The Pine Tree Line came first, a chain of stations running roughly along the border. Then the Mid-Canada Line. Then, in the years immediately following our story, the distant Early Warning Line, the famous Dew Line, a string of stations stretched across the roof of North America, staffed by men who lived in insulated boxes in a landscape that tried to kill them for 8 months of every year. All of it existed for one reason: to buy minutes, not hours. Minutes. Because the estimate, the cold arithmetic that everyone in Air Defense Command carried in their heads was that a Soviet bomber force crossing the pole would, give the continental United States somewhere between 1 and 3 hours of warning if the radar chain worked perfectly. And if it did not work perfectly, the first indication would be a light in the sky over Detroit. So the men watched their screens, and the fighters sat on alert. Kinross Air Force Base sat in the eastern end of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, near Sault Ste. Marie, about 15 miles south of the locks where the water of Superior steps down toward Lake Huron. It was not a glamorous posting. It was a runway, a scattering of buildings, an alert hangar, and a great deal of snow. The base had been built during the Second World War, and then repurposed for continental air defence, which is a bureaucratic way of saying that its entire reason for existing was to sit and wait for something that everyone hoped would never come. The men stationed there flew the F-89 Scorpion. If you have never seen one, picture something that looks less like a fighter and more like a machine that was assembled by a committee that could not agree. The Scorpion was a straight-winged twin-engine, two-seat all-weather interceptor. It was big. It was heavy. It had a distinctive upswept tail that gave it its name, and enormous pods on the wingtips that carried either fuel or rockets or both. It was not fast in the way that later jets were fast. It was not agile. Nobody has ever called the Scorpion beautiful. But it could fly at night, and it could fly in weather, and it carried a radar set, and in 1953 those three qualities mattered more than anything else. A day fighter is useless against a bomber that comes at 3 a.m. through cloud. The Scorpion existed to go up into conditions where a pilot could not see his own wingtips, and find something out there in the dark using nothing but electronics and a second man's voice. That second man is the part people forget. The Scorpion carried a crew of 2. In front sat the pilot who flew the aircraft. Behind him, in a separate cockpit under the same long canopy, sat the radar observer, whose entire job was to operate the radar equipment and talk the pilot onto a target he could not see. The 2 men could not see each other's faces. They spoke through an intercom. In practice, the radar observer became the pilot's eyes in a way that is difficult to explain to someone who has never done it, because the pilot flies on instruments and instinct, while a disembodied voice behind him says, come left more. He is at 11 o'clock now, 12 miles, closing. You put your life in that voice. On the evening of November 23rd, 1953, the 2 men sitting alert at Kinross were First Lieutenant Felix Eugene Moncla Jr. and Second Lieutenant Robert L. Wilson. Let me tell you about them, because they were not characters. They were people, and they were living ordinary Monday evenings until they were not. Felix Moncla was 27 years old. He was from Morrowville, Louisiana, a small town in Avoyelles Parish in the middle of the state, the kind of place where the same family names appear in the church records for 200 years. He grew up speaking the particular French-inflected English of that region. He had served in the army during the Second World War, come home, gone to college at Louisiana State University, and then joined the Air Force and learned to fly. By 1953 he had accumulated more than 800 hours of flight time, several hundred of them in jets. He was rated for all-weather interception. He was, by every account that survives, a competent and unremarkable officer, in the best sense of both words, meaning that nothing about his record suggests recklessness, showboating, or poor judgment. He was married to a woman named Bobby. They had a young son. There was another child on the way. He had been temporarily assigned to Kinross. He was not even permanently stationed there. He had come up from Truax Field in Wisconsin as part of a rotation, one of those administrative details that means nothing at the time and becomes unbearable in hindsight, because if the rotation had fallen differently, he would have been sitting in Madison that night, and someone else would be the name in this story. Behind him sat Robert Wilson. Wilson was 22. He was from Ponca City, Oklahoma. He was newer to the work than Moncla, a radar observer still relatively early in his career, and there is a detail about him that the records preserve and that I find myself thinking about more than almost anything else in this case. Wilson had reported some difficulty with the radar set earlier. He was described afterward as having had trouble tracking the target that night. 22 years old, in the back seat of a jet over the largest freshwater lake in the world, in November, at night, with a radar set that was not cooperating. That is a detail from a maintenance log, but it is also a young man in the dark, working a piece of equipment that will not do what he needs it to do, with his pilot's voice in his ear asking where the target is. Hold that image, we're going to come back to it. The evening began ordinarily. Radar operators at the Sault Ste. Marie Ground Control Intercept Station picked up an unidentified return over Lake Superior. The target was in restricted airspace over the Sioux Locks area. This was, by 1953 standards, an entirely routine event. Unidentified returns happened constantly. Aircraft filed flight plans incorrectly. Transponders failed or did not exist. Weather created false returns. Flocks of birds created returns. Temperature inversions bent radar beams and made distant objects appear where they were not. The correct response to an unidentified return was not alarm. It was procedure. You scramble an interceptor. The interceptor goes and looks. The interceptor reports that it is a lost Cessna or a mail flight or nothing at all, and everyone goes back to their coffee. At approximately 6:18 in the evening local time, the scramble order went out. Picture the alert hangar. Picture two men in flight gear who have been sitting for hours in a room with a card table and a coffee urn and a telephone that everyone stares at. The klaxon goes. There is a particular quality to a scramble that veterans describe as almost pleasant, because it is the release of a coiled tension, the moment when the waiting finally becomes doing. They run. They climb. Ground crew pulls the chocks. The Scorpion's engines wind up, and the sound of an early jet spooling is not the smooth turbine whine of a modern airliner. It is rougher, angrier, a sound with edges on it. At 6:22 in the evening, the F-89 Scorpion lifted off the runway at Kinross and turned northwest over the water. The last time anyone on the ground would see the aircraft, it was climbing away into a black November sky, its navigation lights getting smaller and then not being there anymore, which is what happens to every aircraft on every night and means nothing at all. Except this time, the intercept unfolded over the next half hour, and it unfolded normally, which is the detail that has haunted 70 years of investigators. Ground control vectored the Scorpion northwest, out over the open water of Lake Superior, toward the unidentified return. Moncla climbed to roughly 8,000 feet. The ground controllers at Sault Ste. Marie watched two blips on their scope, one of them theirs and one of them not, and they did the arithmetic of closure that they had done 1,000 times before. The target was moving at a speed that ground control estimated at something around 500 miles per hour. That is fast for 1953, but not impossible. It is roughly the speed of a jet aircraft of the period, and it is also roughly the speed at which a poorly calibrated radar return can appear to move when it's actually something else entirely, Moncla pursued. The Scorpion was not a fast aircraft, and closing on a target moving at 500 miles per hour required time and altitude and careful vectoring. Ground control fed him headings. Come left. Steady. Descend. The chase carried them out over the water, northwest, toward the Canadian side of the lake, into airspace where there was nothing beneath them but 300 feet, then 500 feet, then eventually more than 1,000 feet of water that had been near freezing since the last ice age. In our story, the man giving those vectors is named Lieutenant Charles Reeves. Reeves is fiction. I am inventing him so that we have a pair of eyes on the ground, someone to stand at the scope and watch this happen. But everything he does in the next several minutes is what a real ground control intercept officer would have been doing at that console on that night. Reeves is 31 years old. He has been doing this work for 4 years. He is very good at it, in the particular way that a person becomes very good at something that is 99% boredom, which is to say that his hands know the equipment better than his conscious mind does. He has a cold. He has been drinking coffee that went bitter 2 hours ago. His scope glows a soft green, and the sweep line rotates around it once every few seconds, refreshing the picture of the world, and in the intervals between sweeps the returns fade slightly, so that everything on the screen is always dying and being reborn. There are two returns that matter. One of them is Moncla. One of them is not. Reeves calls the ranges as they close. 20 miles, 18, 15. The gap narrows. This is the good part of the job. The part where the numbers do what they are supposed to do and the geometry resolves, and in a moment somebody up there is going to slide alongside a lost airliner and read a tail number, and everyone can go home. 12. 10. Then Moncla's voice comes through the headset, and Reeves would remember the tone of it for the rest of his life, because it was not alarm, it was confusion. It was the sound a person makes when the world has quietly stopped agreeing with them. Kinross, target is not showing where you have him. Reeves looks at his scope. The returns are nearly touching. There is no possible interpretation of that picture other than that the unidentified aircraft is directly in front of Moncla, within visual range, within a few thousand feet. He tells Moncla the target is right there. 12 o'clock. Close. There is a pause on the frequency. In that pause, Reeves can hear the faint carrier hiss of an open microphone and, underneath it, the hollow roar of the Scorpion's cockpit. Then Moncla again. Quieter this time. In our story, this is the line that Reeves would never repeat to the investigators, not because he was ordered not to, but because he was never entirely certain he had heard it correctly, and a man does not build a career in air defence by testifying to things he is not certain about. I have something below me. Reeves keys the microphone. He asks him to say again. There is no response. On the scope, the sweep line comes around, and there is one return where there had been two. Reeves has seen this before. Every controller has. When two aircraft come close enough together, the radar of that era simply could not distinguish between them, and the two returns would merge into a single blip. It happens constantly during a successful intercept. It is, in fact, evidence that the intercept worked. The correct next event is that Moncla's voice comes through the headset identifying the target, and then the two return separate again as he peels away. Reeves waits for the separation. The sweep comes around. One return. He calls Moncla. Nothing. The sweep comes around. One return. He calls again, using the flight's call sign, using the standard phrasing, then abandoning the standard phrasing entirely. The sweep comes around, and the single return begins to move. Not northwest, the direction the unidentified target had been travelling. North. It tracks steadily north across the scope for a short distance, at a speed Reeves does not have time to calculate, and then it is off the edge of the coverage area, and the screen is empty, and the only sound in the room is the hum of the equipment and the tick of the sweep motor. Moncla and Wilson are gone. There was no mayday. Understand what that means. A mayday call takes half a second. You do not need to say anything except the word. Moncla was a trained officer with a functioning radio, and the radio was demonstrably working seconds before because he had used it. Whatever happened to that aircraft happened in the interval between two radar sweeps, and in that interval, a man who had every reason and every ability to call for help did not call for help. There was no explosion reported, no flash seen from shore, though in fairness there was almost no shore close enough to see anything. There was no debris. There was, for the next 70 years, nothing at all. The search began that night and continued for days. Aircraft flew grid patterns over the lake. Boats went out from the American and Canadian shores. Crews looked for the things that crews always look for: an oiled slick, a life raft, a floating seat cushion, the small bright orange fragments of a survival kit, anything at all that would tell them where to concentrate. They found nothing. Lake Superior is an extraordinarily difficult place to search. It covers roughly 31,000 square miles. In November it produces waves that can exceed 20 feet. The weather closes without warning. Visibility drops to nothing. And critically, in 1953 there was no side-scan sonar in general use, no satellite positioning, no way to know precisely where anything on the surface was, let alone anything 1,000 feet below it. If the Scorpion went into the water intact, it would have sunk immediately and taken everything with it. If it broke up, the debris field would be scattered across miles of open water by wind and current within hours. and if it went down in the deepest part of the lake, it came to rest more than 1,300 feet down, in water at 39 degrees, in absolute darkness, in a place that no available technology of the era could reach. So the failure to find them is not by itself mysterious. Aircraft go into deep water and are never seen again. That is ordinary. What is not ordinary is everything that came afterward. Now we step across the line. Everything from this point forward is our fiction. Keep that with you as you drift, and let it be the kind of story you enjoy rather than the kind you believe. In our version of events, the search was not fruitless. On the second day, a Coast Guard aircraft flying a north-northwest leg over the open lake picked up a signal. It was a distress beacon. In 1953, these were primitive things, simple transmitters carried in survival kits, meant to be triggered manually by a downed airman in a life raft. The signal was weak and it was intermittent, appearing for perhaps 40 seconds, and then vanishing for several minutes before returning. For a few hours the mood at Kinross changed completely. A beacon meant a man meant a raft meant that somebody had gotten out. They vectored a second aircraft to help triangulate, then a third, and it was in the process of triangulating that the operation quietly stopped making sense. The first problem was the strength of the signal. It was attenuated in a manner inconsistent with a surface transmitter. The signal was not weak because it was distant. It was weak because something was between the transmitter and the aircraft. The second problem was the movement. Triangulation over a period of 6 hours showed the source shifting steadily to the north-northwest at a rate of roughly 2 knots. 2 knots is not a drift rate. A raft on Superior in November does not travel in a straight line at a constant speed. It moves with the wind and the surface current, and both of those were coming from the west that week, which meant that anything floating should have been moving east. The source was moving against the wind. The source was moving against the current. And it was doing it at the steady, unhurried pace of something that had somewhere to be. By the third day the signal had ceased entirely, but before it did, a radio technician aboard one of the search aircraft made a note that would, in our story, take a historian 30 years to find. He wrote that the signal characteristics resembled transmission through a medium. He wrote that if he had not known better, he would have said the beacon was underwater and functioning, which was impossible, because those transmitters were not waterproof at depth, and their frequencies did not propagate through water in any useful way. He wrote it in a maintenance log, in pencil, and then he went to lunch, and then he spent the next 50 years not thinking about it. On the fourth day, the search changed hands. This is the part of our story that a person who has worked around the military will recognise as the most plausible piece of fiction in the entire episode, because it is the piece that requires no technology, no cover story, and no conspiracy larger than about 9 men in a room. A Navy liaison officer arrived at Kinross. This was already unusual. Kinross was an Air Force base. The missing aircraft was an Air Force aircraft, and Lake Superior is not an ocean. There was no obvious reason for the Navy to be present at all. He was followed within a day by 2 men from an office that the base personnel could not immediately identify. They were not in uniform. They had authorization that was accepted without discussion. Search assets began to be reassigned. The reason given was weather, and the weather was in fact deteriorating, which made the reason both true and impossible to argue with. Crews that had been flying 12-hour days were stood down. Civilian volunteers who had brought their own boats out from Whitefish Point and Munising were thanked and sent home, and a smaller operation continued, with different equipment, on a different frequency, under a different designation. The paperwork changed one word. Where the operation had been logged as search and rescue, it became, in documents that our fictional historian would eventually hold in his hands, a material recovery operation. Search and rescue means you're looking for people. Material recovery means you're looking for a thing. Nobody at Kinross was told what the material was. The men who had been flying the grids assumed it meant classified equipment. The radar set, most likely. which would have been a legitimate concern in 1953 since an intact interceptor radar was exactly the kind of hardware you would not want washing up on a Canadian beach. That assumption was reasonable. It was also, in our story, wrong. Meanwhile, the official explanation was being assembled, and this is where the real history becomes strange enough that the fiction almost feels unnecessary. The Air Force eventually stated that the unidentified target Moncla had been chasing was a Royal Canadian Air Force C-47 transport aircraft, flying a route across the lake, whose flight plan had been improperly filed or improperly relayed. Moncla, according to this explanation, had intercepted the transport, and then, in the process of manoeuvring, had struck the water. Vertigo was suggested. Spatial disorientation at night over featureless water is a genuine and well-documented killer of pilots, and a man flying at low altitude over a black lake with no horizon can roll his aircraft into the surface while believing he is straight and level. It happens. It has happened many times. There is nothing implausible about that explanation on its face. The problem is that the Royal Canadian Air Force said it did not happen. The Canadians, when asked, reported that they had no aircraft in that area at that time. This position was maintained and restated. The crew of the aircraft that was eventually identified as the supposed target reported that they had not been intercepted, had seen no fighter, and had experienced nothing unusual whatsoever on the flight in question. Over the following decades, the specific aircraft named in the explanation changed. The flight number changed. In some tellings it was a C-47, in others a different type. Researchers who have gone through the records have found that the official account was revised more than once, and that each revision arrived without any acknowledgement that the previous version had existed. That is not evidence of a cover-up. Bureaucracies are genuinely this sloppy. Files get transcribed incorrectly. An officer writes down what he thinks he was told. A press release is issued by someone who was not in the room. 20 years later, a researcher requests documents and gets 3 contradictory versions and reasonably concludes that somebody is lying, when in fact everybody was simply guessing. But it is the kind of sloppiness that leaves a door open, and through that door, 70 years of speculation has walked. In our story, the man who walks through it is named Dr. Nathan Caldwell. Caldwell is fiction. Let me build him for you so that you can see him. He is a historian of Cold War aviation, 61 years old, formerly of a state university in the upper Midwest and now formally retired, which in his case means he has more time and less oversight. He is not a believer in anything. He came to the Kinross case sideways, while writing an entirely unrelated book about the radar chain, and he became interested in it for a reason that has nothing to do with unidentified objects. He became interested because of the paperwork. Caldwell's specialty is administrative history. He reads forms, he reads routing slips and requisition orders, and the carbon copies of memoranda that nobody thought were important enough to classify. And what he noticed about Kinross, before he noticed anything else, was that the paperwork for the search operation did not behave the way paperwork behaves after an ordinary accident. After an ordinary accident, the file gets thick and then stops. After Kinross, the file thinned and then continued in a different hand under different letterhead for 11 more months. He filed his first records request in the spring. He filed 40 more over the following 2 years. He was patient in the way that only a retired academic can afford to be. And the first genuinely strange thing he found concerned the Canadian aircraft. Not the one in the official explanation, a different one. In the archives of the Canadian Department of National Defence, Caldwell located a routine flight record for the night of November 23, 1953. An aircraft had in fact been operating in the general region, transiting from a base in Ontario, well north of the position where Moncla vanished and on a heading that would never have brought it within 50 miles of him. That aircraft was not the target. It could not have been the target. The geometry does not work, but its crew had filed an observation report. The report was brief, and it was written in the deliberately flat language that aircrew use when they are describing something they do not want to be asked about. It stated that at approximately the relevant time, the crew had observed a bright white light in the southern sky. At an altitude they could not determine, which had descended toward the surface of Lake Superior over a period of approximately 90 seconds and had not reappeared. The report was filed, it was stamped, it was placed in a folder. There is no indication that anyone ever connected it to the missing American fighter, for the simple reason that the two events were in different national filing systems, and in 1953 those systems did not talk to each other unless a human being decided to make them. Caldwell decided to make them. He cross-referenced the timing. The Canadian crew's observation, adjusted for the time zone confusion that plagues records from that night, occurred within minutes of the moment the two radar returns merged. The Canadians had watched something go down into the lake, not across the sky, down. Then Caldwell did the thing that separates a historian from a theorist. He went looking for someone who had been there. 4 men were listed on that Canadian crew. 3 were dead. The 4th was a navigator named Thomas Mercer, and Thomas Mercer was 93 years old and living in a care residence outside Thunder Bay, Ontario, roughly 100 miles from the water he had flown over on that November night. Caldwell drove 11 hours to see him. Mercer received him in a common room with a window that faced, as it happened, in the general direction of the lake, though there were trees and a parking structure in the way, and you could not actually see the water from that chair. He was small in the way that very old men become small. His hands shook slightly. His memory of the previous week was unreliable. His memory of November 23rd, 1953 was not. Caldwell asked him what he remembered. Mercer said that he remembered all of it, and that he had never once been asked about it in 70 years, and that he had assumed for most of his life that this was because it did not matter. He described the light. He described it as white and steady, and without any of the flicker or colour separation that a landing light or a flare or a burning aircraft would show. He said that it did not fall. That was the thing he was most insistent about. He said that a falling object accelerates, and this object did not. It went down at the same rate the entire way, the way an elevator goes down, and it went into the water without any splash or plume or flash that they could see, and the water closed over it, and that was all. Then Caldwell asked him about the American fighter, and Mercer's face changed. He asked Caldwell to repeat the question. Caldwell repeated it. He explained that an American interceptor had disappeared that night, that the official account described it as chasing a Canadian aircraft, and that the accepted story had the fighter climbing to intercept a target at altitude. Mercer was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "In our story, the 3 lines that Caldwell would end up building an entire second career around. Everyone keeps saying your pilot went up. That is wrong." Whatever he was following was going down. Caldwell asked him how he could possibly know that, and Mercer said that he did not know it, that nobody had told him anything, that he had spent 70 years assuming that the light he saw and the fighter that vanished were 2 entirely separate events. But he said that if the American aircraft had merged with the object on radar, and if the object was the light he had watched, then the American aircraft had not intercepted anything at altitude at all. It had followed something toward the surface, and Mercer said one more thing before Caldwell left, which he offered without being asked, the way old men will suddenly hand you the thing they have been carrying. He said that after they landed that night, 2 men had come to speak with the crew, not their own officers, men who had arrived from somewhere else. The crew was interviewed individually. They were asked to describe what they had seen, and then they were asked, very carefully and without any threat at all, whether they were certain and whether it was possible that what they had seen was a flare, and whether they understood how many flares were dropped in that region during a normal week. By the end of the interview, Mercer said, he was no longer certain of anything. That is not censorship. Nobody threatened him. Nobody classified anything. They simply asked a 20-year-old navigator whether he was sure, in a tone that made it clear that being sure would be inconvenient, and then they thanked him and left. It works better than an order. An order has to be enforced. Doubt enforces itself. Caldwell drove the 11 hours home, and somewhere on the north shore of the lake in the dark with the water on his left and nothing on his right, he pulled over and sat with the engine running and thought about what he was actually doing. Because up to that point he had been a historian correcting a record. From that point on he was going to be something else. The next thing he found was not one document, it was a pattern. Caldwell began pulling incident reports from Air Force and Royal Canadian Air Force units operating in the Lake Superior region between 1946 and 1953. He was not looking for unidentified objects. He was looking for equipment malfunctions, because equipment malfunctions are boring, and boring things do not get classified. And a historian learns to find the truth in the places nobody thought to hide it. Over 7 years, in an area covering the lake and roughly 100 miles of surrounding airspace, he catalogued 41 reported instances of the following: radar returns that appeared, tracked briefly, and vanished without correlating to any known flight; compass deviations in aircraft, reported and logged, in which the magnetic compass swung as much as 30 degrees and then returned to normal after the aircraft left a specific area; radio interference on multiple frequencies simultaneously, described repeatedly by different crews as a low pulsing sound rather than static; lights observed descending toward the surface of the lake at night, in 11 separate reports, filed by 11 separate crews who did not know one another; and 3 instances of what the paperwork called anomalous low-altitude contacts, meaning radar returns tracking below the minimum altitude at which any aircraft could reasonably be flying over open water at night. Each one of those reports taken alone is nothing. Radar sets failed constantly in that era. Compasses were affected by local magnetic anomalies, and the Superior Basin genuinely has significant iron deposits that can and do affect magnetic instruments. Radio interference is the natural state of the universe. Pilots see lights. Any single report is noise. But Caldwell did what nobody had done, which was to plot them. He put every incident on a map of the lake with a dot for each one, and when he stepped back from the map he found that the dots were not distributed evenly across 31,000 square miles. They were clustered. Nearly 2/3 of them fell within an oval, roughly 40 miles long, in the northeastern portion of the lake, in the deepest water. And in the middle of that oval, almost exactly, was the last plotted position of Felix Moncla's aircraft. It took another year to find the word. It came, as these things always come, from a document that was released by accident in a batch of unrelated material, because a reviewing officer somewhere had been told to declassify everything in a filing category, and had done exactly that without reading it. The document was an Air Force memorandum dated March of 1952. It concerned budget allocation for continental air defence support activities in the Northern Lakes District. It was 3 pages long and almost entirely composed of numbers. On the second page, in a list of ongoing programmes receiving continued funding, was a designation Caldwell had never encountered in 20 years of working in this material: water glass. There was no explanatory text. There was a funding line and an authorization code and a date of establishment, which was given as June of 1951, 2 years and 5 months before Felix Moncla disappeared. Caldwell spent the next 18 months chasing that word. He found it 4 more times, once in a personnel transfer order, once in a shipping manifest for equipment delivered to a Navy facility in Michigan, once in a handwritten annotation on the margin of an unrelated report, where someone had written the word and then a question mark and then crossed both out, and once, finally, in a partially redacted program summary that had been improperly filed in the records of an entirely different command, where it sat misplaced and therefore invisible for 6 decades. That summary contained a single sentence of objective, and it is a sentence I want you to hear slowly, because the fiction of tonight's story lives entirely inside its phrasing. Continuous observation of anomalous aerial and subsurface activity within designated northern freshwater regions. Read it again in your mind: aerial and subsurface. The United States military, according to our story, had established a program in 1951 whose stated purpose was to watch not only the sky above Lake Superior, but the water beneath it, and it had done so 2.5 years before an interceptor and its crew disappeared into that water. which raises the question that Caldwell could not stop asking. Why Superior? Why not Michigan, or Huron, or Erie? All of which are closer to the industrial heart of the country, and all of which would be more obviously worth defending. Why the emptiest, coldest, deepest, least strategically valuable of the Great Lakes? The answer, in our story, was in the geophysical surveys. Beginning in the late 1940s, several institutions conducted magnetic and seismic surveys of the Superior Basin. This is real work with real reasons behind it. The Superior Basin sits atop the mid-continent rift, a scar in the crust of North America more than 1 billion years old, where the continent very nearly tore itself in half and then, for reasons that are still debated, stopped. The rift left behind enormous volumes of dense volcanic rock, and that rock produces genuine and significant magnetic anomalies. Compasses in that region really do misbehave. That is geology, and it is well documented, and there is nothing mysterious about it. But in our story, the survey teams found something the geology did not explain. In a limited area of the northeastern basin, the magnetic anomaly was not simply strong, it was structured. It varied on a cycle. The deviation would increase over a period of roughly 19 hours, hold, and then decrease, and then repeat. And it did this regardless of season, weather, solar activity, or anything else the teams could correlate it with. Rock does not do that. Rock sits there. Rock has been sitting there for 1 billion years and will continue to sit there, and whatever magnetic signature it has constantly. Then, in 1950, a hydrophone array installed for an entirely unrelated purpose, the testing of underwater sound propagation in fresh water, recorded something in the same area. A pulse, low frequency, near the bottom of the range of human hearing, so low that a person standing in the water would not have heard it so much as felt it in the bones of the chest. It repeated at an interval of approximately 11 seconds. It continued for 4 days, then it stopped. It was recorded again 9 months later, and again after that. The recordings were attributed to seismic activity, which was a reasonable attribution and which nobody seriously questioned, because the alternative was to question something that nobody wanted to question. But somebody, somewhere in the chain, read those reports and did not accept the attribution. And in June of 1951, a program was funded. Waterglass, in our story, was not a weapons program. It was not a research program in any conventional sense. It was, in the language of the summary Caldwell found, an observation activity. It had a small staff. It had a modest budget. It had hydrophones, magnetometers, and access to the radar data from the ground control intercept stations along the northern border. Its job was to watch, and to record, and to say nothing. For 2.5 years, it did exactly that. And then, on the evening of the November 23rd, 1953, something came out of the lake. An Air Defense Command, following standard procedure and knowing nothing about any of this, scrambled a fighter at it. Except that in our story, it did not know nothing. The document that changed Caldwell's understanding of the entire case was the mission sheet. Every scramble generates paperwork. A form is filled out, generally in a hurry, generally by a duty officer with a telephone against his ear, and it records the aircraft, the crew, the time, and the nature of the tasking. It is an unremarkable document. It exists so that somebody in an accounting office can reconcile flight hours at the end of the month. Caldwell obtained a photostat of the Kinross mission sheet for the 23rd of November, 1953, from a private collection, purchased at an estate sale, in a box of material that had belonged to a base administrative officer who had, against regulations and to the enormous benefit of history, taken his files home with him when he retired. The form is mostly what you would expect: aircraft type, tail number, crew names, Moncla and Wilson, written in a hand that was clearly moving fast. The tasking line is not what you would expect. A standard tasking for this kind of mission would read something like unidentified aircraft, identify and report. That is the phrasing. That is what the form is for. The Kinross sheet does not say unidentified aircraft. It says intercept contact 7 Bravo. Observe only, do not engage. Caldwell sat with that photostat for a long time. 3 things are wrong with it. The first is contact 7 Bravo. That is not a phrase that describes an unknown. You do not give a designation to something you have never seen before. A designation implies a category, and a category implies precedent, and the letter Bravo implies that there is an alpha somewhere, and the number 7 implies that there were 6 of these before. The second is observe only. That is not standard interception language. Interception language is identify. You go, you look, you report what it is. Observe only is the phrasing you use when you already know what it is and you have decided what you want done about it. And the third is do not engage. That instruction was given to a pilot who had been told he was chasing an unidentified aircraft over his own territory. You do not tell a man not to shoot at something unless you have some reason to believe he might want to. Caldwell went looking for contacts 1 through 6. He found them in fragments across 4 archives and 2 countries and a decade of requests, and the pattern they describe is the spine of our story. The first was in August of 1951, 2 months after Waterglass was funded. A radar station on the Canadian shore tracked a return that appeared over open water at low altitude, climbed to approximately 40,000 feet over the course of 4 minutes, held that altitude while travelling in a wide arc across the eastern end of the lake, then descended and disappeared from coverage. Total duration, 26 minutes. It was logged as an equipment fault. The second, in November of 1951, followed a nearly identical profile. Emerge, climb, circle, descend, 29 minutes. The third, in 1952, was observed visually. A weather reconnaissance crew reported a white light travelling parallel to their aircraft at an estimated distance of 8 miles, matching their speed and heading for approximately 3 minutes before turning away and descending. They reported no sound, no exhaust, no navigation lights, no discernible structure. The fourth and fifth are known only from a single summary line each, and the fifth is partially redacted, and Caldwell believes, though, cannot prove that something happened during that one that was different from the others. The sixth was in July of 1953, 4 months before Kinross. A pair of interceptors was scrambled from a base in Wisconsin. They were vectored toward the contact. They closed to within approximately 15 miles, and then the contact descended at a rate the radar operators described as beyond the capability of any known aircraft, and was gone from the scope before the fighters could close further. The pilots saw nothing. They flew over empty water and went home. The pattern is consistent, and it is the least dramatic thing about our story, and it is therefore the most convincing. Something came out of the lake. It went up. It moved around for between 20 and 40 minutes. It went back into the lake. It did this roughly twice a year. It did not approach populated areas. It did not approach military installations. It did not respond to aircraft, and on the one occasion when interceptors were sent, it simply left. It behaved, in short, like something conducting a survey. And for 2.5 years, the standing order from Waterglass was to watch it and not to interfere, which is exactly what Moncla was told to do. Observe only, do not engage. So what went wrong? Caldwell's answer to that question required a radar reconstruction, which he commissioned from a specialist in historical radar data, working from the original plot boards and the controller's log, and it revealed the detail that the official account has never addressed in 70 years, because the official account has never had a reason to look at it. For the entire intercept, up until the final 90 seconds, the geometry is a pursuit. Moncla is behind the target and closing slowly. The target is not manoeuvring. This is a chase. In the final 90 seconds, the target's track changes. It does not accelerate away. It does not climb. It turns. It comes around through nearly 180 degrees, in a radius that the reconstruction specialist noted as physically impossible for a manned aircraft of that period or any period, and it steadies on a heading directly toward the oncoming interceptor. The closing speed at that point, combining Moncla's airspeed with the target's, would have exceeded 1,000 miles per hour, 10 miles, 6 miles, 2 miles, which at that closure rate is less than 7 seconds. And this is when Moncla's voice comes onto the frequency, confused, and says that the target is not showing where ground control has him, because it was not in front of him anymore. I have something below me, the returns merge, and what leaves is a single contact tracking north, and then descending, and then gone. For 6 of those incidents, the object had come out of the lake and gone back into it. On the 7th, it took something with it. The expedition sailed in the summer of 1954. Officially, it was a geological survey conducted from a converted vessel out of a Great Lakes port, studying sediment deposition and bottom composition in the Eastern Basin. The cover was excellent because it was almost entirely true. Sediment cores were taken. Papers were eventually published from that data, and if you look them up you will find them, and they are unremarkable. What was not published was the sonar work. The vessel carried an experimental echo-ranging system, and it spent 11 days running north-south lines across a 40-mile oval in the deepest part of the lake, the oval that Caldwell would map from incident reports 6 decades later, without ever knowing that anyone had mapped it before him. On the 7th day, the sonar returned something that the operator initially logged as a fault. The bottom of Lake Superior in that region is soft. It is a thick blanket of glacial clay and silt, deposited steadily since the ice retreated roughly 10,000 years ago, and it produces a sonar return that is diffuse and gentle, like snow. What the operator saw was not diffuse. It was an edge, a hard return, at a depth of approximately 1,100 feet, rising perhaps 60 feet above the surrounding bottom, and continuing across the width of the sonar sweep, and then continuing across the next sweep, and the next. They spent 4 days mapping it. The shape that emerged from those 4 days was a circle, approximately half a kilometre in diameter, not roughly circular, the way a natural formation is roughly circular. The variation in radius across the entire structure was less than 2%. There were surface features, regular ones. A ring of raised elements around the perimeter, evenly spaced, and the operator counted them twice and got the same number both times. The centre was depressed relative to the ring, and most of it was buried. The sediment cores taken around the perimeter showed undisturbed deposition, consistent with the entire post-glacial history of the lake. Whatever that structure was, it had been sitting there while the ice sheet melted, while the first people walked into North America, while the copper miners of the Upper Peninsula worked the shores 6,000 years ago, while every empire that has ever existed rose and ended. It had been there before any of it, which is the moment where our story stops being about a missing airplane. Because if you find something like that, you do not classify it because you are hiding an aircraft. You classify it because you have just discovered that the history of your continent has a flaw under it that nobody knew about. They found the Scorpion on the 11th day. It was approximately 400 metres from the edge of the structure, at a slightly shallower depth, and the sonar profile was unmistakable to anyone who had spent time looking at aircraft. Length, wingspan, the distinctive mass of the wingtip pods, it matched an F-89. The recovery team's first reaction was relief, and it was almost joyful, because after 8 months the only thing anyone had wanted was to find those men and bring them home to Louisiana and Oklahoma and let their families put something in the ground. They lowered a camera. This was 1954, and the camera was a heavy steel housing on an armoured cable with a lamp bolted to it, lowered blind, and the images came back as still photographs developed on board hours later. The first thing wrong was the attitude of the aircraft. An aircraft that strikes water at speed does not remain an aircraft. It becomes a debris field. The wings separate. The engines, being dense, continue forward and tear free. The fuselage buckles. This is invariable. Water at 200 knots is not soft. The Scorpion in those photographs was intact. Both wings attached, both wingtip pods present, fuselage unbuckled, the tail undamaged. It was sitting on its belly, level, on the sediment, with a shallow trough behind it consistent not with an impact but with settling, the way a heavy object settles when it is set down on something soft and then allowed to sink into it. The canopy was closed, and the second thing wrong, which the recovery team did not understand for another 2 days, until a diver reached it in a hard suit at the limit of what was possible in 1954, was that the cockpit was empty, not damaged. Empty. Both seats were unoccupied. The ejection systems were unfired. Both parachutes were present and packed. The canopy locking mechanism was in the closed and secured position from the inside. There is no procedure by which 2 men leave a sealed aircraft, secure it behind them, and depart at 1,100 feet in water at 39 degrees. There was one alteration to the interior. Wilson's radar display, the scope in the rear cockpit, was burned through. Not cracked from pressure. The phosphor coating had been carbonized uniformly across the entire face of the instrument, as though it had been exposed to an enormous energy input in a very short time. The surrounding instruments were undamaged. The wiring behind it was intact. Whatever burned that scope came through the scope and stopped there. They recovered what they could of Wilson's equipment. The radar of that era included a recording function, a strip of film that captured the scope image for post-flight analysis. The film was in poor condition. 11 months in cold fresh water had done what cold fresh water does, but roughly 40 seconds of it were readable, and those 40 seconds covered the end. For most of it, the image is what you would expect. Ground clutter, the target return, the range marks. In the final 11 seconds, the target return is gone, and the entire scope is filled with interference. But the interference is not random. It appears in bursts. The film shows discrete groups of bright frames separated by dark intervals, and when a technician sat down and counted them, he got a sequence. 1 burst, then 1, then 2, then 3, then 5, then 8, then 13. The film ends there. The technician did not recognize it. He wrote it down as a numbered list in his report because that is what you do with numbers you do not understand. A mathematician attached to the program recognized it immediately. Each number is the sum of the 2 before it. It is the Fibonacci sequence, and it is one of a very small handful of things that a mathematically literate species anywhere in the universe would produce, because it is not a human invention. It is a property of arithmetic itself. It appears in the spirals of shells and the arrangement of seeds and the branching of trees, and it can be derived by anyone, anywhere, who can count, which is exactly why it has been proposed over and over as the content of a first message. You do not open with a greeting. A greeting requires a shared language. You open with a demonstration that you can count, and you wait to see whether the other party can count back. And that is the conclusion that our fictional program arrived at, in a room somewhere in 1954, with a strip of ruined film on the table. The object had understood that it was being observed. It had noticed the aircraft noticing it. It had turned toward the thing that was watching it, and in the last seconds before it took that aircraft, it had transmitted the simplest possible proof that it was not a phenomenon. It said hello, and nobody was in a position to answer. Now, why bury it? I want to spend a moment here, because the burial is the part of every conspiracy story that is usually handled worst. Writers wave a hand and say the government covered it up, as though that were an explanation rather than a description. It is worth asking what the men in that room in 1954 would actually have been thinking, because in our story their reasoning is not villainous. It is understandable, and that makes it worse. Consider the year. The Korean War armistice had been signed in July of 1953, 4 months before Kinross. The Soviet Union had detonated a thermonuclear device in August of that year. Joseph Stalin had died in March, and nobody in Washington knew who was actually in charge in Moscow or what they intended. Senator Joseph McCarthy was at the peak of his influence. and the country was in the middle of a genuine collective panic about internal subversion, and separately, the country was in the middle of something else. The summer of 1952 had produced the Washington Flap, in which unidentified radar returns appeared repeatedly over the Capitol, over restricted airspace, over the White House, and fighters were scrambled, and it made the front page of every newspaper in America, and the Air Force held the largest press conference it had convened since the end of the war, in order to explain that it had all been temperature inversions. Some of it probably was. But the public reaction had frightened the Air Force badly, and what frightened them was not the objects. It was the switchboard. During the flap, the volume of civilian reports was so large that it clogged the reporting channels that would have been used to detect an actual attack. That was the stated institutional concern, and it is documented, and it is genuinely the reason that a great deal of official effort went into making the public stop looking up. The danger, as the Air Force understood it, was not that unidentified objects would hurt anyone. The danger was that a panicking public would blind the defence network at the exact moment it was needed. Now put yourself in that room in 1954. You have a structure at the bottom of Lake Superior that predates human civilization in North America. You have an intact interceptor sitting next to it, with the canopy locked from the inside and no crew. You have a mathematical transmission. And you have a country that already cannot handle the idea of lights over Washington. What do? In our story, they did the only thing that institutions ever do, which is nothing, slowly and with paperwork. They did not fabricate an elaborate cover story, because elaborate cover stories fall apart. They did something far more effective. They allowed the existing confusion to stand. The Canadian aircraft explanation was already circulating. It had emerged organically, from an ordinary bureaucratic mess, from a duty officer's guess written on a form. The Canadians disputed it. The details did not match. The aircraft type changed between tellings, and all of that contradiction was left exactly where it was. Because a clean cover story invites a single, coherent counter-argument, but a mess invites 40 of them. If the official account is contradictory, then every researcher who comes to the case spends his energy attacking the contradictions, and each one attacks a different one, and they disagree with each other, and after 70 years the case has a reputation for being confusing, rather than a reputation for being unexplained. Confusion is a better fence than a wall. A wall tells you there is something behind it. There was in our story a quiet understanding reached between American and Canadian officials, at a level not high enough to require anyone to write it down. Neither government would formally identify the target. Neither would formally close the file. The disagreement about the Canadian aircraft would simply be allowed to persist, indefinitely, unresolved. It worked perfectly. It has worked for 70 years. Ask anybody who knows about the Kinross incident what the main mystery is, and they will tell you it is the business with the Canadian transport. That is the fence. Waterglass continued, which brings us to the last thing Caldwell found, and the worst thing, and the reason that in our story he stopped writing the book he'd been working on, and started making copies of everything he had, and mailing them to 4 different people. He obtained analysis results from the sediment cores taken near the structure in 1954, and from a second set taken in the 1970s with better equipment. The sediment dating was unambiguous. Undisturbed deposition, 10,000 years, exactly as expected. The structure has been down there since the ice, but the second set of cores had included fragments, small pieces of material recovered from the sediment immediately adjacent to the perimeter ring, presumably shed or eroded from the structure itself. The composition analysis on those fragments is the part I want you to hear. The material was described as a metallic composite that the laboratory could not fully characterize with the techniques available. That by itself means very little. Laboratories fail to characterize things constantly. But they could date the surface oxidation, and the fragments recovered adjacent to a structure buried for 10,000 years showed surface exposure consistent with a period of decades, not millennia, decades. There are two possible readings of that result. The first is contamination, or laboratory error, or a chain of custody problem, and honestly, that is almost certainly the correct reading of any such result in the real world. The second reading is the one that ended Caldwell's sleep. The structure is ancient, the material in it is not, which means that some portion of it has been replaced, which means that something is maintaining it, not was, is. That structure is not a ruin, it is not wreckage, it is not the tomb of some ancient visitor who came here and died, and was covered by the patient snow of 10,000 years of sediment. It is in service. And this is where Caldwell said that the entire 70-year history of the Kinross case had been asking the wrong question. Everyone asks where Moncla's aircraft crashed. Every expedition, every sonar survey, every enthusiastic team with a boat and a magnetometer has gone out onto that lake looking for a crash site. But in our story, there was no crash. The aircraft was intact. It was set down. It was placed 400 metres from the perimeter of the structure, the way you might set an unfamiliar object on a table in order to look at it more carefully. The lake was not hiding a wreck. The lake was a destination. And the final question, the one that Waterglass spent 40 years trying to answer and never did, was what the structure was for. The behaviour pattern suggests a single answer, and it is not an invasion, and it is not a threat, and in some ways it is more unsettling than either. Objects emerge, they ascend, they travel in wide arcs across a defined region, they return, twice a year on average, for as long as anyone was watching. That is not an attack posture. That is a survey. That is the behaviour of an instrument taking a periodic reading. And when Caldwell plotted the frequency of those emergences against a timeline, he found the correlation that made him stop working for 2 weeks. Before 1945, the recorded incidents in that region are sparse. Fishermen's accounts, lightkeepers' logs, a handful of lights over the water spread thin across a century. After July of 1945, the rate increases sharply. July of 1945 is Trinity. It is the first atomic detonation in the history of the world, and it is also, and this is a genuine and documented historical curiosity, almost exactly when the ghost rockets began appearing over Scandinavia, hundreds of reports of objects moving over Sweden and Norway and Finland, some observed to descend into lakes, prompting a serious military investigation that never reached a conclusion. Northern lakes, deep, cold, freshwater lakes, in the years immediately after humanity learned to split the atom. 2 mysteries on 2 continents that nobody has ever put side by side. Something under the world's deep northern water had been reading us for a very long time, at a slow and patient interval, twice a year, the way you might check on a garden. And then in the summer of 1945 the reading changed, and whatever was taking it started checking more often. There is one more piece. Late in his work, Caldwell was contacted by a woman whose father had died the previous year. Her father had spent 31 years as a communications archivist for the Air Force, and among the things in his basement was a reel of 1/4-inch tape in a canister with a handwritten label that read only Kinross and a date. She did not know what to do with it. She had found Caldwell's name because he had published a short article in a regional history journal, and she had assumed he would want it, and she was correct. The reel was in poor condition. Tape that age becomes brittle, and the binder degrades, and it had to be baked slowly in a low oven for 2 days before it could be played even once. Caldwell had it transferred by a preservation lab that specialises in this work and asks no questions. Most of the recording is ordinary. It is the ground control frequency, and it contains routine traffic, and a person listening to it without context would find it excruciatingly boring, which is the single most convincing thing about it. Then the intercept begins. You hear Reeves, or the man our story calls Reeves, calling the vectors. You hear the flat, professional, slightly bored cadence of a man doing his job. You hear Moncla acknowledging. You hear the rangers close. Then you hear the line about the target not showing where ground control has him, and the confusion in it is very clear when you hear it in a human voice rather than reading it on a page. Then the line about something below him. And in the publicly known version of this incident, That is the end. Static. On the reel Caldwell received, the transmission continues for 11 more seconds. The first thing you hear is a change in the background noise of the cockpit. It does not stop. It changes pitch, dropping, the way a sound does when something enormous is happening to the air around it. Then Moncla says, and his voice has gone very calm in the way that trained people go calm at the moment, when there is no longer any point in being anything else, that it is underneath him. There is a pause of about 3 seconds. Then he says that there is light coming through the water. Think about what that sentence requires. He is at altitude, at night, over open water. Light coming up through the surface of Lake Superior from beneath, bright enough to see from an aircraft, means a source of enormous intensity at depth. Then there is another pause, and the last thing Felix Moncla says on that recording is not a report. It is not procedure. It is a man forgetting entirely that he is on a radio. He says, "God, there are more of them." And then the recording ends. But that is not the last piece. Because in the 2000s, Caldwell had the transfer analysed by an audio restoration specialist, using techniques that did not exist for the first 50 years this tape sat in a basement. And underneath Moncla's transmission, at a level far below the noise floor, there was another voice. It is not Wilson. Wilson's intercom would have been on the same channel and at the same level, and would have been audible without any processing at all. It is not the ground controller. It is not on the frequency in any conventional sense. The specialist described it as riding underneath the carrier, present in the recording as a modulation of the signal itself rather than as a sound picked up by a microphone. It is a man's voice. It is speaking slowly and evenly and without emotion. It is speaking numbers. The restoration recovered 11 of them with gaps. Caldwell spent a week working out what they were, and then he stopped working on anything else for a month. They are coordinates, latitude and longitude, in the format that a 1950s military aviator would use. They correspond to a position in the northeastern basin of Lake Superior. They are the coordinates of the point where the two radar returns merged. And here is the part that Caldwell could never resolve, and could never publish, and could never quite stop thinking about at 3 a.m. The voice appears on the tape before Moncla arrives at those coordinates. The timing is not ambiguous. The controller's log gives the elapsed time of the intercept, and the tape can be synchronized against it, and the numbers are being spoken roughly 4 minutes before the merge, when the Scorpion was still more than 30 miles away, and being vectored on a heading that had not yet been finalized. 4 minutes before it happened, something was reciting the location where it would happen, not predicting it, announcing it. Now let me bring you to the present, and then I will let you sleep. In our story, in a recent summer, a research vessel is running survey lines in the eastern basin of Lake Superior. It is a legitimate scientific expedition, mapping bottom composition, entirely unconnected to any of this. The crew are graduate students and technicians and a captain who would rather be somewhere warmer. Their sonar returns an anomaly. A hard, bright, elongated object on the bottom at 1100 feet, with a profile that the software flags as consistent with a small aircraft. They check the coordinates against the historical database. There is one hit, and it is a well-known one, and the atmosphere on that vessel changes completely within about 90 seconds, because every person aboard who has spent any time on that lake knows the name Moncla. They notify the authorities. They hold position overnight. Nobody sleeps. In the morning they deploy a remotely operated vehicle, which is a thing that did not exist in 1954 and which now costs less than a decent car, with high-definition cameras and lights and a fibre tether, and it goes down through 1100 feet of black water at a stately 40 feet per minute, while everyone on board watches a screen. The bottom comes into view, soft grey sediment, faintly rippled, with the tracks of some small bottom-dwelling thing meandering across it. There is nothing there. They check the position. It is correct within a few meters. They run a search pattern. Nothing. No aircraft. No debris. No depression in the sediment where a heavy object has recently rested. The sonar operator, arguing with a screen, reruns the previous day's data, and confirms that the return was there and is not there now. And then, while they're still arguing about it, the sonar picks up movement. Something at approximately 800 metres distance, rising. It comes up through the water column steadily, not fast. The rate is smooth and constant and does not vary, the way an elevator rises, the way a light descends when it is not falling. The captain gets the remotely operated vehicle back aboard, because a captain's instincts are worth more than anyone's curiosity, and he starts the engines. The object breaks the surface roughly a mile off the port side in daylight, in front of 11 witnesses with phones. None of the footage will ever come out clearly. It never does. The object is described afterward as bright and featureless, and roughly the size of a small building, and it rises out of the water without any of the streaming and cascading that would attend a solid object emerging from a lake, and it climbs. Radar at 3 separate facilities acquires it within 4 minutes. Fighters are scrambled from bases in Michigan and Wisconsin, which are much faster and much better instrumented than an F-89 Scorpion. And as the object passes through 20,000 feet, a second contact appears beside it. Smaller, aircraft-sized. It was not there a moment before, and it did not climb from the surface. The identification systems on the modern interceptors attempt to interrogate it, and the transponder response that comes back is a code that has not been in the active database for 6 decades, and when the system resolves it against the historical tables, the aircraft type it produces is an F-89C, an airframe that was retired from service before most of the men flying that day were born. Ground control attempts contact on every frequency. There is a long silence, and then a burst of static, and then a man's voice, clear and unhurried, and mildly annoyed in the specific way of a pilot who is tired and would like to go home. He says, "Kinross Control, this is Lieutenant Moncla, target intercepted, requesting vector home," and nobody on that frequency knows what to say to him. Because Kinross Air Force Base closed in 1977, the runway is still there. It is a county airport now. There are industrial buildings on the old base, and a state correctional facility, and streets with the names of squadrons that no longer exist. His wife Bobby is gone. The son he had is an old man. The child that was coming has grandchildren. Everyone he would have flown home to has lived an entire life and finished it. And here is the final turn of our story, the thing that makes it a horror rather than an adventure. The conspiracy was never about concealing what killed Felix Moncla and Robert Wilson. They were not killed. Their aircraft was taken beneath Lake Superior by something operating from an installation that has been sitting under that water since before there were cities anywhere on this planet. Something that has been checking on us at a patient, unhurried interval, and that began checking more often the moment we learned to split the atom. And whatever happened to the 2 men inside that aircraft, wherever they have been, however that time has passed for them, it has not been 70 years. For Felix Moncla, it may still be the 23rd of November. He is 27 years old. He has a wife at home and a son and another child on the way. He is somewhere over the lake with a young man from Oklahoma behind him, working a radar set that will not quite cooperate. And he is still waiting for someone to give him a heading. That is the story of Kinross. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review also helps out so much. And if you'd like, comment what time it is for you and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. And of course, if you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing. Now, let's dive into tonight's story. The Smithsonian's Darkest Secrets. What if the bones were too big to explain? Picture this: a team of excavators in Ohio, 1879, uncovering a burial mound. The dig proceeds normally until they reach the central chamber. There, arranged in ceremonial position, lies a skeleton. But something is wrong. The femur is too long. The skull is too large. The ribs extend far beyond normal human proportions. The team measures carefully. They document everything. They contact the Smithsonian Institution, America's premier scientific authority. Representatives arrive. They examine the remains. They carefully pack everything into crates. The crates are loaded onto wagons, then trains. They disappear into the vaults of the nation's most trusted museum. And then, according to some researchers, those bones are never seen again. This is the central allegation that has haunted the Smithsonian Institution for over a century. Not a single dramatic cover-up, but a pattern. A systematic removal of evidence that challenges our understanding of the past. Artifacts that don't fit the established narrative, quietly set aside. Discoveries that raise uncomfortable questions, lost in bureaucratic shadows. The Smithsonian Institution stands as the world's largest museum and research complex. 19 museums, 9 research centres, 140 million artifacts and specimens. It defines American history for generations of schoolchildren. It shapes our collective memory of who we were and how we came to be. Millions walk through its halls each year. They stand before dinosaur skeletons and moon rocks. They examine the Wright brothers' flyer and the Star-Spangled Banner. They trust that what they see represents the complete story of human achievement and natural history. But what if some discoveries never made it to the display cases? What if the story we've been told is incomplete? Not because of malicious conspiracy, but because institutions, like people, sometimes choose comfort over confrontation. Tonight, we examine the allegations. We follow the paper trails. We explore the missing artifacts, the vanished records, and the persistent claims that history has been edited before reaching our eyes. We'll hear from believers and skeptics. We'll examine evidence and counter-evidence. We'll ask uncomfortable questions about the institutions we trust to preserve truth. This is the story of the Smithsonian's Darkest Secrets. A story that begins not with malice, but with money. Not with conspiracy, but with a gift that would change American science forever. Chapter 1. The Rise of an Authority. The Smithsonian Institution was born from the will of an Englishman who never visited America. James Smithson, a British scientist and mineralogist, died in 1829 in Genoa, Italy. His life had been devoted to scientific inquiry. He published 27 papers on chemistry and geology. He travelled throughout Europe collecting mineral specimens. He was a Fellow of the Royal Society, one of the most prestigious scientific organisations in the world. But Smithson harboured a resentment. He was the illegitimate son of the Duke of Northumberland. Though brilliant, he could never inherit his father's title or estate. British society, for all its scientific advancement, still judged men by birth rather than merit. Perhaps that's why his will contained such an extraordinary clause. If his nephew, Henry, James Hungerford, died without heirs, Smithson's entire estate would go to the United States government. The purpose: to found at Washington, under the name of the Smithsonian Institution, an establishment for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. Why America? Smithson never explained. He never visited the country. He had no known American connections. But he saw in the young republic something Britain lacked: the promise of meritocracy, a place where knowledge mattered more than lineage. The nephew died childless in 1835. The inheritance worth over $500,000 in gold sovereigns became available. This was an enormous sum, equivalent to well over $10 million today. But Congress hesitated. Should the United States accept a gift from a foreign citizen? What strings might be attached? What would this institution actually do? Debate raged for nearly a decade. Some wanted a national university, others proposed an observatory, a library, or a museum. Former President John Quincy Adams, then serving in Congress, championed the cause. He argued that accepting Smithson's gift was a matter of national honour. Finally, in 1846, President James Polk signed the act establishing the Smithsonian Institution. The legislation was deliberately vague about the institution's specific mission. It would promote knowledge. The details would evolve. Joseph Henry, a renowned physicist, became the first secretary. He envisioned the Smithsonian primarily as a research institution, not a museum. He wanted to fund original scientific investigation and publish findings. He was less interested in collecting objects, but the building itself suggested otherwise. Architect James Renwick designed a castle in red sandstone, with towers and crenellations evoking medieval fortresses of knowledge. It looked like a place to house treasures, not just conduct research. From the beginning, the Smithsonian faced a fundamental tension. Would it be a research institute or a museum? Would it generate new knowledge or preserve existing discoveries? The answer became both. And in trying to be both, it accumulated power. The timing was perfect. America in the mid-1800s was experiencing an explosion of archaeological discoveries. As the frontier expanded westward, as railroads cut through previously unmapped territory, as settlers ploughed fields and built foundations, they encountered evidence of ancient habitation. Burial mounds dotted the landscape from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Earthworks of staggering scale emerged from forests being cleared for farmland. Artifacts surfaced. Copper tools, shell beads, stone carvings, ceramic vessels. Who made these? The question consumed popular imagination. Native American tribes had oral histories about some sites, but the sheer scale of certain earthworks seemed beyond what small tribal groups could accomplish. Also, white Americans reasoned bringing their own biases to interpretation. The Smithsonian positioned itself as the authority on these questions. It dispatched researchers across the expanding nation. It collected specimens by the thousands. It established protocols for excavation and preservation. It decided what was scientifically significant and what was mere curiosity. Cyrus Thomas, employed by the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology, beginning in 1882, led extensive surveys of ancient mounds throughout the eastern United States. His mission was clear: determine who built the earthworks that puzzled settlers and scientists alike. Thomas was methodical. He visited hundreds of sites. He supervised excavations. He catalogued thousands of artifacts. He reviewed every account, every theory, every wild speculation about ancient builders. His conclusion, published in 1894 in a massive report, became institutional orthodoxy. The mounds were built by ancestors of contemporary Native American tribes, not by a separate vanished race. There were no lost civilizations, no mysterious mound builders. The engineering and labour were entirely within the capabilities of indigenous peoples. This was actually progressive for its time. It countered racist theories that Native Americans were too primitive to have built such structures. It acknowledged indigenous achievement and continuity. But it also established a pattern. The Smithsonian would define the boundaries of acceptable history. It would determine what theories deserved consideration and what theories were pseudoscience. It would decide which artifacts merited preservation and which could be discarded as unimportant. And with authority comes power. The power to decide what is remembered. The power to choose what is forgotten. The power to shape collective memory. By the early 20th century, the Smithsonian had become the central repository for American archaeology. If you discovered something significant, you contacted the Smithsonian. If you wanted funding for excavation, you needed Smithsonian approval. If you hoped to publish findings in respected journals, you needed Smithsonian endorsement. This centralization had benefits. It prevented duplication of effort. It raised standards for archaeological practice. It protected sites from amateur looters. But it also created vulnerability. A single institution now controlled access to much of the physical evidence of America's past. And if that institution had blind spots, biases, or reasons to avoid certain questions, there were few checks on its authority. The conspiracy theories that would haunt the institution for the next century were already taking root. Because as the Smithsonian accumulated artifacts by the tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, questions arose that have never been satisfactorily answered. What happened to everything they collected? Where did it all go? How were decisions made about what to study, what to display, what to store, and what to quietly remove from consideration? And if something challenged their conclusions, would they have any incentive to share it? Or would the easier path be to set it aside, catalogue it vaguely, and let it disappear into the vast collections where few would ever look? These weren't unreasonable questions then. They aren't unreasonable now. Chapter 2. The Giant Skeleton Claims. The newspaper accounts are extensive and surprisingly consistent. The New York Times, November 10th, 1880, page 5. A giant's bones. The body of a man 11 feet 4 inches high discovered near Middletown, Ohio. The San Diego Union, August 5th, 1877. Front page. Remains of giants unearthed. Skeletons of extraordinary size found in California burial mounds. The Indianapolis News, November 10th, 1875. Remains of gigantic size disinterred near Greencastle. The skeleton measured 8 feet from crown to heel. The Worthington, Advance, Minnesota, May 10th, 1888. A giant's bones unearthed. Remains measuring 9 feet in length found during excavation of Indian mound. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of similar reports appear in newspapers across America between 1850 and 1920. They describe the discovery of human skeletons measuring 7, 8, 9, even 10 feet tall, often found in burial mounds, frequently accompanied by copper tools, shell beads, and other artifacts suggesting ceremonial burial. The reports follow a remarkably consistent pattern. Local excavators, often farmers or construction workers, make a discovery while digging. They recognise the bones as human but note unusual size. They contact local authorities or newspapers. The story is published. Scientists or museum representatives are contacted. The remains are measured, documented and packed for transportation to institutions like the Smithsonian for further study. And then, according to conspiracy theorists, the trail goes cold. Researchers today who try to locate these skeletons in Smithsonian collections claim they cannot find them. The catalogue numbers don't match existing records. The accession documents are incomplete or missing. The specimens have been deaccessioned or lost in transfer, or simply cannot be located despite extensive searching. Let's examine a specific case in detail. In May of 1897, the Times of London reported on excavations in Lovelock Cave, Nevada. The site yielded numerous artifacts and skeletal remains. According to reports, some of the skeletons measured significantly above normal human height ranges. The tallest supposedly measured 8 feet, 4 inches. The excavation was supervised by James Hart Mercer, an archaeologist who worked with the Smithsonian. His field notes, which still exist in archives, describe skeletal material of unusual dimensions. He arranged for the remains to be shipped to Washington for analysis. Modern researchers seeking these specific bones have been unable to locate them in Smithsonian collections. The institution acknowledges receiving materials from Lovelock Cave, but the catalogue descriptions don't match Mercer's field notes. Heights listed are within normal ranges. The unusually large specimens are absent. What happened? 3 possibilities. First, the measurements were wrong. Mercer was working in difficult conditions. Bones were fragmentary. He might have misassembled remains or measured incorrectly. Second, the bones were misidentified. Large animal bones were mistaken for human remains. This happened frequently in early archaeology. Third, the bones existed as described but have since been lost, destroyed, or deliberately removed from the collection. The conspiracy theory embraces the third explanation, but the first two are more probable, and yet the pattern repeats across dozens of cases. The most famous allegation involves a Supreme Court case that never actually happened. In 2005, a story began circulating online. It claimed the Smithsonian Institution had been sued in federal court for destroying evidence of giant skeletons. The supposed lawsuit was filed by the American Institution of Alternative Archaeology. The court allegedly ruled in favour of the plaintiffs, ordering the Smithsonian to release classified documents proving the institution had destroyed tens of thousands of giant human remains in the early 1900s. The story was elaborate. It included fake quotes from Smithsonian officials admitting the destruction. It referenced specific case numbers and court dates. It spread rapidly through conspiracy theory websites and social media. Except none of this happened. There is no such court case, no ruling, no American Institution of Alternative Archaeology. The entire story was a fabrication, created by a satirical website and then taken seriously by people who wanted to believe it. When confronted with the hoax, true believers didn't abandon the theory. They claimed the debunking itself was part of the cover-up. The fact that no evidence existed for the lawsuit proved how powerful the conspiracy was. But the fabricated lawsuit built on a foundation of genuine mystery. Because those 19th century newspaper reports are real, they exist in archives. You can read them yourself in digitized historical newspaper collections. So what explains them? The official position is straightforward and, honestly, pretty convincing. Early American archaeology was chaotic and unscientific. Professional archaeology didn't really exist as a discipline. Most excavations were conducted by amateurs. Measurements were inaccurate, standards for documentation didn't exist. Giants were actually normal skeletons that appeared larger due to several factors. Soil displacement and geological pressure could spread bones apart, making them seem larger than life size. Decomposition and mineralization could cause bones to expand. Enthusiastic local boosters exaggerated findings to attract attention and tourists. Newspapers of that era printed sensational stories without rigorous verification. If a farmer claimed he found giant bones, the local paper might print it without investigation. Some cases have clear, documented explanations. A giant skeleton discovered in New York in 1871 turned out to be a mastodon. The initial report described it as human before expert examination revealed the truth. The mysterious 7-foot skull found in Missouri in 1894 was from a cave bear. The finder genuinely believed it was human. Only later analysis corrected the identification. The Cardiff giant, perhaps the most famous giant of the era, was an outright hoax. A 10-foot-tall stone figure uncovered in New York in 1869. Thousands paid to see it. Scientists from Yale examined it. Some declared it proof of ancient giants mentioned in the Bible. It was eventually revealed as a carved gypsum statue, created by an atheist named George Hull specifically to mock biblical literalism. But not before making its creator thousands of dollars and fooling numerous educated people. If educated scientists could be fooled by an obvious fake carved from soft stone, how much easier would it be for amateurs to misidentify unusual animal bones? But not all reports fit this explanation. Some described skeletons excavated by trained observers. Some included multiple independent witnesses. Some were documented by reputable scientists of the era who should have known the difference between human and animal remains. In 1891, Professor Thomas Wilson of the Smithsonian's Department of Prehistoric Anthropology wrote about excavations in Ohio. His report mentioned human remains of extraordinary stature found in association with clearly human artifacts. Wilson was a trained anthropologist. He wasn't likely to confuse a mastodon with a human. What happened to the remains he described? They should be in the collection. The catalogue numbers exist, but the specimens cannot be found. The conspiracy theory asks a simple question. If even a handful of these reports were accurate, if humans significantly taller than normal once lived in North America, what happened to the evidence? And the answer conspiracy theorists arrive at is equally simple. The Smithsonian made it disappear, not because of malice, not because of some grand plan, but because these remains didn't fit the accepted narrative of human development. They raised questions that couldn't be easily answered. They complicated the story the institution was tasked with telling, so they were set aside, catalogued vaguely, stored in boxes that nobody opened, and over decades they were simply lost in the vast holdings of an ever-growing collection. Is this what happened? We can't know for certain, but the gaps in the record remain, and gaps, once noticed, are hard to ignore. Chapter 3. Missing Artifacts and Vanished Records. In 1991, a researcher named Vine Deloria Jr. published a book called Red Earth, White Lies, Native Americans and the Myth of Scientific Fact. Deloria was a Standing Rock Sioux, author, theologian, historian and activist. He held degrees from Iowa State, the Lutheran School of Theology, and a law degree from the University of Colorado. He wasn't a fringe conspiracy theorist. He was a serious scholar with legitimate credentials. His book challenged conventional archaeology on multiple fronts, but one chapter focused specifically on the Smithsonian Institution. He claimed the institution had a pattern of losing or discarding artifacts that didn't fit accepted timelines for human habitation in the Americas. Deloria cited specific examples: stone tools found in geological layers at Hueyatlaco, Mexico, supposedly too old for human presence in the Americas. The tools existed, the excavation was professional, but the implications were so disruptive to accepted chronology that the findings were marginalized. Carved figurines from Nampa, Idaho, depicting extinct animals that humans weren't supposed to have encountered. The figurines were genuine artifacts, but they were found in geological contexts that suggested impossible antiquity. Rather than forcing reconsideration of timelines, they were labelled as somehow displaced or contaminated. Metal objects from cultures that supposedly hadn't developed metallurgy. Copper axes, bronze implements, iron tools found in contexts that predated when these technologies were supposed to exist in the Americas. Deloria's claim wasn't that the Smithsonian was maliciously destroying evidence. His argument was more subtle and in some ways more damning. He suggested the institution had become so invested in a particular narrative of American prehistory that it couldn't accommodate evidence that challenged that narrative. Artifacts that fit the story were carefully preserved, studied and displayed. Artifacts that didn't fit were treated with skepticism, catalogued vaguely, stored in less accessible locations and gradually forgotten. He cited excavation reports that referenced artifacts no longer in collections, catalogue numbers that led nowhere, requests to examine specimens that were denied or redirected to different materials entirely. Other researchers echoed these concerns. They pointed to early 20th century expedition reports that described remarkable finds that should have revolutionized understanding of ancient America. But the artifacts described in those reports couldn't be located in current collections. An 1897 expedition to Tennessee Mounds, led by Smithsonian archaeologists, documented in their field report the discovery of unusual metallurgical specimens showing evidence of smelting techniques not previously documented in eastern woodlands cultures. The catalogue, numbers assigned to these items, still exist in the archives, but the items themselves cannot be found. A 1913 field notebook from an Arkansas excavation describes carved stones bearing undeciphered symbols suggesting organised writing system. The notebook is carefully preserved in the Smithsonian archives. Researchers can read the detailed descriptions, view the hand-drawn sketches of the symbols, but the stones themselves are not in the collection. An 1884 letter from a Smithsonian curator to a colleague mentions receiving skeletal material of unusual proportions, requiring further anatomical study. No follow-up correspondence exists. No study was published. The specimens are not listed in current catalogues. Are these innocent casualties of time and institutional change? Almost certainly some are. The Smithsonian has experienced fires, floods and relocations. Materials have been damaged or destroyed through accident rather than intent. Early cataloguing systems were inconsistent. Items were sometimes accessioned under descriptions that don't match current search terms. Storage facilities have changed. Collections have been reorganised multiple times. All of this creates natural gaps in institutional memory. but the pattern of gaps surrounding specifically anomalous artifacts is striking. Items that would have been controversial, that challenged accepted theories, seem disproportionately likely to be among the lost. The Smithsonian's response has been consistent. Early archaeological practice was poor. Documentation was incomplete. Many early excavations were conducted by amateurs who made claims without proper evidence. Items were sometimes accessioned based on donor descriptions that later proved inaccurate or exaggerated. When the institution couldn't verify the provenance or authenticity of an artifact, it was de-accessioned. This wasn't conspiracy. It was responsible museum practice. Museums cannot keep everything. Decisions must be made about what merits preservation and what doesn't. But critics point out an uncomfortable reality. Who decides what can be verified? What standards of evidence are applied? And if an artifact challenges fundamental assumptions about the past, might there be unconscious bias in how rigorously it's examined? If a stone arrowhead is found and donated, it's probably accepted with minimal scrutiny. It fits what we expect. But if a complex mechanism is found in an ancient context, might it face higher standards of proof? Might researchers look harder for reasons to dismiss it? This is the insidious nature of confirmation bias. It's not deliberate dishonesty. It's the human tendency to accept evidence that confirms existing beliefs and scrutinize evidence that challenges them. The deeper researchers dig into Smithsonian records, the more gaps they find. And these aren't just random gaps. They cluster around specific types of claims, evidence of human presence in the America's earlier than accepted timelines, evidence of technological sophistication in cultures deemed primitive, evidence of anatomical variation in ancient human populations, evidence of cultural achievements that challenge narratives of linear progress. Each individual gap might have an innocent explanation, but the pattern of gaps creates suspicion, and once that suspicion exists, absence of evidence becomes its own kind of proof. If the Smithsonian isn't hiding anything, why can't they produce the artifacts described in their own historical records? Why aren't the specimens mentioned in century-old expedition reports available for modern analysis with advanced techniques? The official answer remains: they probably never existed as described, or they weren't what people thought they were, or they were lost through ordinary institutional processes over more than a century of operations. But conspiracy theorists hear a different message. They did exist. They were exactly what people thought, and now they're conveniently gone. Chapter 4. Advanced Ancient Knowledge. The stone walls at Sacsayhuaman in Peru fit together so precisely that you cannot slide a knife blade between them. Some blocks weigh over 200 tons. They were somehow transported miles from quarries, lifted into position, and cut with such accuracy that no mortar was needed. The Great Pyramid of Giza was the tallest human-made structure on Earth for over 3,500 years. Its base is levelled within less than an inch. Its sides align almost perfectly with true north. The interior passages demonstrate sophisticated understanding of mathematics and engineering. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck off Greece in 1901, contains gear systems and astronomical calculations that wouldn't appear again in European technology for over a millennium. It predicted solar eclipses, tracked planetary movements, and calculated the Olympic Games cycle. Ancient civilizations achieved things that challenge our understanding of their capabilities. This is not conspiracy theory. This is established fact, acknowledged by mainstream archaeology. But the question becomes, how much more advanced were they than we acknowledge? And more importantly, what evidence of that advancement has been minimized, overlooked, or deliberately ignored because it doesn't fit comfortable narratives of gradual technological progress? Some conspiracy theorists claim the Smithsonian has actively downplayed evidence of technological sophistication in ancient cultures, particularly in the Americas. The allegation isn't that ancient people had computers or aircraft. It's more subtle and, honestly, more plausible. The claim is that evidence of advanced knowledge, precision engineering, and sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and metallurgy has been systematically minimized to maintain a narrative of gradual, linear progress from primitive to advanced. The favourite model in mainstream archaeology is evolutionary. Hunter-gatherers become farmers. Farmers build villages. Villages become cities. Cities develop writing. Writing enables mathematics. Mathematics enables engineering. Each step follows predictably, logically, from the last. It's a comforting narrative. It suggests progress is inevitable. It implies our current civilization is the pinnacle of human achievement. But what if the pattern wasn't so linear? What if ancient people understood principles we think they couldn't have grasped? What if technological knowledge was sometimes lost rather than continuously accumulated? Conspiracy theorists point to specific examples that trouble mainstream explanations. The Peary-Reyes map of 1513 shows coastal details of South America with remarkable accuracy. More controversially, it appears to show coastline features of Antarctica that wouldn't be mapped by modern explorers until centuries later. The map's creator, Ottoman Admiral Peary-Reyes, claimed he based it on much older source maps, some dating to the time of Alexander the Great. How did ancient cartographers map Antarctica? The conventional answer, they didn't. The map shows South America's coast, and the Antarctic portion is misidentified coastline or pure fabrication. But the accuracy of other portions of the map makes this explanation less satisfying. The Baghdad battery, discovered in Iraq in 1936, consists of a clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod. When filled with acidic liquid, it generates small electric current. It dates to approximately 2,000 years ago. Was this actually a battery, or just a scroll container that happens to generate current as a side effect? Mainstream archaeology favours the latter, but experimental archaeology has shown these devices could effectively electroplate objects. Did ancient metallurgists understand principles of electrochemistry? Precision-drilled holes in granite at ancient Egyptian sites show characteristics that modern engineers associate with high-speed drilling equipment. The holes are perfectly circular, maintain consistent diameter through hard stone, and show spiral grooves suggesting rapid rotation. Conventional archaeology argues they were made with copper tools and sand abrasive, through patient application of rotational pressure. But experimental attempts to replicate these holes using proposed ancient methods have struggled to match the precision and speed suggested by the archaeological evidence. The Smithsonian's position on these artifacts is carefully calibrated. The institution acknowledges the sophistication. It marvels at ancient ingenuity. Its exhibits celebrate the achievements of past civilizations. But it argues these achievements are explainable within the bounds of known, ancient technology and knowledge. The Peary-Reyes map drew on older sources, but those sources were medieval or classical, not impossibly ancient. The Baghdad battery might have been used for electroplating, but this doesn't prove systematic understanding of electricity. The Egyptian drillings were accomplished through techniques we haven't fully rediscovered, but that doesn't mean they required advanced technology. The conspiracy theorist argues, but what if we're underestimating these civilizations not because of evidence, but because we're committed to a particular narrative of human development? What if our models of technological progress are oversimplified? What if we've set the bar for ancient achievement artificially low, then use that lowered bar to dismiss evidence that exceeds it? Consider a specific case that illustrates this tension. In 1964, geologist Virginia Steen McIntyre was part of a team dating artifacts from Hueyatlaco, Mexico. They used multiple dating methods: uranium series, tephrohydration, and stratigraphic analysis. All methods consistently indicated the tools were over 250,000 years old. This created an obvious problem. Anatomically, modern humans weren't supposed to exist 250,000 years ago, let alone in the Americas. The accepted timeline for human migration to the Americas was roughly 12,000 to 15,000 years ago. Steen McIntyre's findings, if accurate, would demolish that timeline. They would require complete reconsideration of human evolution and migration patterns. Her findings were rejected. Papers were refused publication. Colleagues distanced themselves. Her career suffered significantly. She later claimed she experienced direct institutional pressure from organizations including the Smithsonian. Pressure to reinterpret the data. Suggestions that her dating methods must be flawed. implications that publishing such findings would damage her professional reputation. Was this conspiracy, or was it simply the scientific process working as intended, subjecting extraordinary claims to extraordinary scrutiny? The line between healthy skepticism and close-minded orthodoxy is extremely thin, and institutions like the Smithsonian, which help define where that line falls, hold enormous power over what becomes accepted knowledge. Steen McIntyre's work remains controversial. Some researchers argue her dating methods were sound, and archaeology needs to reconsider timelines. Others maintain the dates must be incorrect because they conflict with overwhelming evidence from other fields. But notice what happened. The evidence wasn't destroyed, it wasn't hidden, it was questioned, criticised, and largely dismissed. The artefacts still exist, but they've been relegated to anomaly status. They don't appear in textbooks, they don't inform the standard narrative taught to students. This is a subtler form of information control than physical destruction of artefacts. It's the power to decide what evidence matters, what deserves attention, what merits inclusion in the official story. And that power, exercised over decades by institutions like the Smithsonian, shapes our entire understanding of the past. Chapter 5. Indigenous History and Narrative Control. The Mound Builder myth was one of 19th century America's most destructive historical frauds, and one with lasting consequences. It went like this. The impressive earthworks and burial mounds throughout the eastern United States were too sophisticated, too large, too precisely engineered to have been built by Native Americans. They must have been constructed by a separate, vanished race of mound builders who possessed advanced knowledge and civilization. These mysterious mound builders were variously theorized to be lost tribes of Israel who migrated to the Americas, wandering Europeans or Phoenicians who reached North America in antiquity, survivors from Atlantis or other legendary civilizations, an advanced race that was conquered or absorbed by primitive native tribes. This wasn't just academic speculation. It served a direct political purpose. If Native Americans hadn't built the mounds, they had no special historical claim to the lands that contained them. They were recent arrivals, just like European colonists. Therefore, westward expansion could proceed with reduced moral complication. If indigenous peoples weren't connected to the ancient civilizations that once flourished here, their displacement was less troubling. The myth was widespread, believed by prominent Americans, including Thomas Jefferson, who wrote about it extensively. It appeared in newspapers, textbooks, and scientific journals. It shaped policy and public opinion. The Smithsonian's Cyrus Thomas demolished this myth with his 1894 report on the mound explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology. He proved conclusively through careful excavation and analysis that Native American ancestors built the mounds. The engineering was entirely within the capabilities of indigenous peoples. The cultural continuity was clear. This was real scholarship, opposing racist pseudo-history. Thomas deserves credit for applying scientific rigour to politically charged questions, but some researchers claim the Smithsonian went too far in the opposite direction. In the effort to combat the mound builder myth, they argue, the institution minimised the genuine complexity and sophistication of pre-Columbian North American civilizations. The conspiracy theory goes like this. Acknowledging truly advanced indigenous civilizations would raise uncomfortable questions. It would force recognition of what was lost during European colonization. It would complicate the narrative of European civilization bringing progress and enlightenment to a primitive continent. It would create moral and legal complications regarding land rights and historical injustice, so evidence of that complexity and advancement when it appeared was acknowledged but not emphasized. It was studied but not celebrated. It was preserved but not prominently displayed. Consider Cahokia, the ancient city near modern St. Louis, Missouri. At its peak around the year 1100, Cahokia was larger than London. Its population exceeded 10,000, possibly reaching 20,000. Its central plaza covered 40 acres. Monk's Mound, the largest earthwork, rose 100 feet high and covered 14 acres at its base. It contained more material than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This was an urban civilization. It had sophisticated agriculture supporting large populations, extensive trade networks reaching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, complex social hierarchies and specialised labour, advanced astronomical knowledge demonstrated by structures precisely aligned with solstices and equinoxes. Cahokia was not a village, it was a metropolis, and it existed at the same time as medieval European cities. Yet how many Americans learned about Cahokia in school? For most people educated before the late 20th century, the answer is none. It simply wasn't taught. It wasn't part of the standard curriculum. It didn't appear in history textbooks alongside accounts of European medieval cities. Why not? The evidence was there. Archaeologists knew about Cahokia. The Smithsonian had extensive materials from the site. But Cahokia didn't fit the narrative. It complicated the story of indigenous peoples as primarily hunter-gatherer societies. It suggested pre-Columbian civilization in North America was far more advanced than commonly believed. The city collapsed mysteriously around 1300, before European contact. Climate change, resource depletion, social upheaval, possibly epidemic disease. The reasons remain debated. But its very existence challenged comfortable assumptions. So it was studied by specialists but not integrated into popular understanding of American history. This is changing. Cahokia is now recognised as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It appears in modern textbooks. Public awareness is growing, but for over a century, despite being the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico, it was effectively absent from mainstream historical consciousness. The conspiracy theory asks, what else don't we know? What other achievements were documented, then quietly forgotten? What evidence of indigenous technological advancement, astronomical knowledge, or cultural complexity never made it into textbooks because it was inconvenient? Consider another example, the astronomical alignments at Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. Chaco was a major centre of ancestral Puebloan culture from approximately 850 to 1150. Its great houses are precisely aligned with solar and lunar cycles. Structures mark solstices, equinoxes, and lunar standstills with remarkable accuracy. This demonstrates sophisticated astronomical observations sustained over generations. It required detailed record-keeping, mathematical understanding, and engineering precision. Yet for decades, mainstream archaeology attributed these alignments to coincidence, or was simply silent about them. The idea that primitive societies carefully tracked celestial movements made some scholars uncomfortable. It suggested knowledge and sophistication that didn't fit prevailing assumptions. Modern archaeology fully acknowledges Chacoan astronomical knowledge, but for how long was this evidence available but not emphasized? The pattern repeats. Evidence exists of ancient indigenous achievement. Evidence is preserved in museums and academic collections, but evidence is not prominently displayed, not featured in textbooks, not integrated into popular understanding. Is this conspiracy? Not in the traditional sense. It's something more subtle and perhaps more pervasive, cultural bias expressed through curatorial choices made over decades. The Smithsonian didn't destroy evidence of indigenous achievement, but did it choose to emphasize certain narratives while downplaying others? Did it make decisions about what merited prominent display versus storage in archives? And were those decisions influenced, consciously or unconsciously, by prevailing cultural attitudes about indigenous peoples? Modern archaeology is correcting this. Indigenous scholars are reclaiming their history. Collaborative projects between researchers and tribal nations are producing more complete, more accurate accounts of the past. The Smithsonian itself has become more collaborative, more inclusive, more willing to acknowledge indigenous expertise about their own histories. But the question persists. How much time was lost? How many artifacts were categorized incorrectly, stored improperly, or simply ignored because they didn't fit expected narratives? And how would we know what we're missing? If evidence was never prominently displayed, if it never entered public consciousness, if it languished in storage for a century, the effect is the same as if it never existed. This is the power of institutional gatekeeping, not to destroy truth, but to determine which truths receive attention. Chapter 6. Whistleblower Stories. The stories appear on forums, blogs, and alternative research websites with remarkable consistency. Different authors, different time periods, but similar themes. A former Smithsonian curator, speaking on condition of anonymity, claims they were instructed to reclassify certain artifacts to less provocative categories. Items initially catalogued as undetermined origin or requires further study were recategorized as natural formation or modern contamination without additional analysis. A researcher who worked in the institution's storage facilities in the 1980s describes being told certain areas were off limits without clear explanation. When they asked about specific catalogue numbers that should have been in those restricted areas, they were redirected to different materials entirely. An archaeologist who submitted findings to Smithsonian journals in the 1990s claims their work was rejected not for methodological flaws but for implications that would confuse the public. The rejection letter, which they claimed to have kept but never publicly shared, supposedly stated that while the research was sound, publication would generate more questions than the current evidence base can answer. A museum technician who worked at the Smithsonian in the 2000s reports finding boxes in deep storage labelled with catalogue numbers that didn't appear in digital databases. When they brought this discrepancy to supervisors' attention, they were told the items were awaiting proper cataloguing and not to worry about it. The technician claims they later tried to locate those same boxes and couldn't find them. These accounts are impossible to verify. No names are provided, no documentation is offered. No corroborating witnesses come forward. They exist in that frustrating grey zone between plausible and provable. Could these things have happened? Absolutely. Institutional politics exist everywhere. Museums make curatorial decisions that aren't always transparent. Researchers do face pressure to conform to accepted narratives, but without verification, these stories remain rumour. They prove nothing beyond the fact that people are willing to claim such things occurred, yet they persist and multiply. The pattern of anonymous whistleblower accounts has become part of conspiracy culture around the Smithsonian. The most detailed account comes from a person claiming to be a former Smithsonian anthropologist who worked there in the 1970s. This account has circulated online in various forms for years. According to this story, the individual was assigned to catalogue skeletal remains from southwestern excavations conducted in the 1960s. The remains were from multiple sites, most fitting normal demographic patterns for the cultures and time periods involved. But among the hundreds of specimens, several stood out. The account describes skeletal remains showing unusual proportions, not wildly outside normal ranges, but statistically anomalous. Heights that would have been remarkable for the populations and time periods they supposedly represented. Upon reporting these unusual specimens to supervisors, the whistleblower claims they were initially told to document everything normally. Measurements were taken, photographs were made, preliminary analysis was conducted. But then, according to the account, the unusual specimens were separated from the main collection. They were moved to a different storage area. The individual was informed that further analysis had determined the measurements were erroneous due to bone displacement and mineralization effects. When they asked to see the revised analysis, they were told it was handled by senior staff and wasn't available for review. The unusual specimens were reclassified as within normal variation. The original measurements were noted as preliminary and superseded. No further study was conducted that the whistleblower was aware of. The specimens were filed away. The catalogue entries made no mention of the initial unusual findings. The account continues. When this individual asked colleagues about the situation, they were told, off the record, that the institution had guidelines about what kinds of claims could be made based on skeletal evidence. Extraordinary measurements required extraordinary context and documentation. Without clear provenance and supporting evidence, it was better to err on the side of conservative interpretation. One supervisor allegedly told them, "We don't have context for these anomalies. Without context, they create more confusion than clarity. Our job is to educate the public, not generate sensational headlines." The whistleblower claims they remained at the Smithsonian for several more years, but grew increasingly uncomfortable with what they perceived as unwillingness to pursue uncomfortable questions. They eventually left for a position elsewhere and later shared their story anonymously. Is this account real? There's no way to confirm it. The level of detail suggests someone with genuine institutional knowledge. The described procedures sound plausible for how large museums operate. But it could also be complete fabrication by someone familiar with museum operations, creating a story that sounds authentic without being verifiable. This is the essential problem with whistleblower accounts. They exist in the absence of hard evidence. They appeal to people already suspicious of institutions. They confirm existing beliefs rather than challenging them. And yet, complete dismissal seems unwarranted. Institutions do sometimes prioritize reputation over transparency. Scientists do face pressure to conform. Curatorial decisions are sometimes made for political or practical reasons rather than purely scientific ones. The truth probably lies somewhere between conspiracy and complete innocence. Not deliberate destruction of evidence, but a culture that favours certain kinds of findings over others. Not malicious cover-up, but selective attention driven by unconscious bias and institutional inertia. That's actually more concerning than cartoon villainy, because it's harder to address and easier to deny. Chapter 7. Why the Smithsonian is targeted. Why does the Smithsonian attract these conspiracy theories while other museums largely escape similar accusations? The answer lies in the institution's unique position within American cultural and scientific infrastructure. The Smithsonian isn't just another museum. It's the museum. It's a federal institution with authority and resources unmatched by any private collection. It sets standards for museum practice nationwide. It influences educational curricula. Its conclusions shape textbooks, documentaries, and public understanding of history and science. When the Smithsonian makes a determination about an artifact's age, origin, or significance, that determination carries weight across the entire field. Other institutions defer to Smithsonian expertise. Publishers rely on Smithsonian research. Teachers present Smithsonian conclusions as established fact. This creates enormous responsibility, and responsibility creates pressure. The institution holds more American archaeological and anthropological material than any other organisation. If something was discovered in the United States and deemed scientifically significant in the last century and a half, there's a substantial probability it ended up in Smithsonian collections. This creates a paradox. The organisation most capable of preserving and studying controversial evidence is also the organisation most invested in established narratives. It has the most to lose from paradigm shifts that would invalidate decades of previous work, publications, and institutional positions. Think about the incentive structure. You're a Smithsonian curator with decades of experience. You've published extensively on the peopling of the Americas, arguing for the Clovis first model, which suggested humans arrived in the Americas around 13,000 years ago, via the Bering Land Bridge. Then evidence emerges suggesting much earlier human presence. Monteverde in Chile, dated to 14,500 years ago. Pre-Clovis sites in North America. Genetic evidence suggesting multiple migration waves. This evidence contradicts your life's work. Do you immediately embrace the new findings and acknowledge your previous conclusions were wrong? Subject the new evidence to rigorous scrutiny, looking for methodological flaws? Resist paradigm change until the evidence becomes absolutely overwhelming? Most scientists choose option 2, which is actually appropriate. Extraordinary claims should face rigorous examination, but there's a fine line between healthy skepticism and entrenched resistance. And when an entire institution has built its reputation on certain historical narratives, that line becomes even harder to navigate. The Smithsonian is also tied to government, which amplifies conspiracy thinking. It's formally a trust instrumentality of the United States, created by Congress and partially funded through federal appropriations. This connection to government makes it a target for people who generally distrust federal institutions. If you believe the government routinely lies to citizens about significant matters, why wouldn't that extend to the Smithsonian? If cover-ups occur in national security or politics, why not in archaeology? The theory becomes less about specific malicious acts and more about institutional inertia and risk avoidance. Consider a scenario. A donor brings an artifact to the Smithsonian. It's unusual. Initial analysis suggests it might challenge accepted timelines for technological development in ancient cultures, but the provenance is unclear. The context is ambiguous. You, as a curator, have several options. Display it prominently, acknowledging uncertainty but inviting public engagement with the mystery. Study it extensively, committing significant resources to what might ultimately prove to be a misidentified or contaminated specimen. Catalogue it conservatively, note the uncertainties, and store it for potential future study when better analytical methods might be available. Set it aside as insufficiently documented to merit serious attention. Which choice serves the institution's mission of education and research? Which serves your career advancement? Which protects the institution's reputation for scientific rigour? Which creates the least immediate disruption? In most cases, the conservative choice wins, not because of conspiracy, but because of bureaucracy, because of limited resources and competing priorities, because of reputational concerns and risk aversion. And over decades, those individual conservative choices accumulate. They create patterns. They generate gaps between what exists in collections and what receives attention. And gaps, once noticed by persistent researchers, fuel conspiracy theories. The Smithsonian also suffers from its own success. Its collections are so vast, 140 million items, that complete organisation and accessibility is nearly impossible. Even with modern database technology, materials slip through cracks. Catalogue numbers don't match physical locations. Items are stored in facilities that don't have comprehensive digital inventories. This ordinary chaos of managing massive collections becomes sinister when researchers can't find specific items they're looking for. The mundane explanation is, the collections are huge and imperfectly organised. The conspiratorial explanation is, items were deliberately hidden or removed. Both might be partially true. The collections are huge and imperfectly organised, and some items were probably deliberately set aside, not out of conspiracy, but out of curatorial judgment about what merited limited resources and attention. The institution has also made genuine mistakes throughout its history. It's displayed forgeries as authentic artefacts. It's made claims about human evolution that later proved incorrect. It's supported now debunked theories about ancient cultures. These mistakes are actually evidence that science works through self-correction. They show the institution is capable of admitting error and updating positions based on new evidence. But they also demonstrate fallibility. And once people realise an authority is fallible, trust becomes conditional rather than automatic. The Smithsonian conspiracy theories endure because the institution occupies a unique position combining enormous authority over historical narratives, federal government connection, vast collections with inevitable organisational imperfections, history of genuine mistakes and course corrections, incentive structures that favour conservative interpretations. This combination makes it a natural target for conspiracy thinking, regardless of whether actual conspiratorial behaviour has occurred. Chapter 8. Official Responses and Rebuttals. The Smithsonian Institution has addressed these conspiracy theories multiple times over the decades, with increasing frustration as the internet age has amplified their spread. Their official position is remarkably consistent. The institution does not destroy evidence for ideological or political reasons. The institution does not hide artifacts that challenge established theories. The institution applies rigorous scientific standards to all specimens, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. When conspiracy theorists point to 19th century, newspaper accounts of giant skeletons, Smithsonian representatives and mainstream archaeologists respond with several counter-arguments. First, early American archaeology lacked professional standards. Most excavations were conducted by amateurs with no formal training. Measurements were frequently inaccurate. Documentation was poor or non-existent. When a 19th century newspaper reports a skeleton measuring 9 feet, modern archaeologists ask, who measured it? What methods were used? Was the skeleton complete or reconstructed from fragments? Were the bones properly identified as human rather than animal remains? In most cases, these basic questions cannot be answered because the documentation doesn't exist. The newspaper reports offer sensational claims without methodological detail. Second, there are numerous documented cases of misidentification. Large animal bones were frequently mistaken for giant human remains. Mastodons, mammoths, and large extinct mammals left bones that could appear human to untrained observers. The giant skull, discovered in Missouri in 1894, initially reported as evidence of an ancient race of giants, was later identified as belonging to a cave bear. The finder was genuinely convinced it was human, but expert analysis proved otherwise. Without the actual bones available for modern analysis, we cannot know how many giant skeleton reports were similar misidentifications. Third, geological and biological processes can create illusions of greater size. Bones can be displaced by soil movement, making scattered remains appear to represent a larger individual than they actually do. Mineralization can cause bones to expand. Decomposition can separate remains in ways that suggest greater dimensions. Fourth, hoaxes were common. The Cardiff giant, the Piltdown Man, numerous other fraudulent discoveries fooled respected scientists in their time. If trained observers could be deceived by deliberate fakes, how much easier would it be for amateurs to misinterpret genuine remains? The absence of these giant skeletons in current collections has mundane explanations. They never existed as described. They were animal bones misidentified as human. They were normal human remains measured incorrectly. They were hoaxes. They were destroyed in fires, floods, or other disasters that affected museum collections. They were lost during one of the Smithsonian's several relocations and reorganizations. They were deaccessioned when provenance could not be verified. Any of these explanations is more probable than deliberate destruction to hide evidence. When conspiracy theorists claim specific artifacts have disappeared, Smithsonian archivists point out the realities of managing historical collections. The institution has accessioned materials for over 175 years. Early catalogue systems were inconsistent. Items were sometimes recorded under descriptions that don't match modern search. Terms, storage locations changed multiple times. Different departments used different numbering systems. Finding a specific artifact from a 19th century accession can be genuinely difficult, even for staff with full access to collections and databases. This doesn't mean the item was hidden. It means institutional memory is imperfect, and early record keeping was inadequate by modern standards. Additionally, museums regularly deaccession materials. This isn't destruction of evidence, it's responsible collection management. Items are deaccessioned when provenance cannot be verified. The item is a duplicate of better specimens already in the collection. The item is deteriorating beyond conservation capacity. The item was misidentified and doesn't actually represent what it was catalogued as. The item is more appropriate for a different institution's collection. These decisions are documented and reviewable. They're not secret, but they do mean that not everything ever accessioned remains permanently in the collection. When critics claim the institution downplays evidence of advanced ancient technology, archaeologists offer context. Ancient civilizations were sophisticated. This is acknowledged and celebrated. But sophistication doesn't mean they possess knowledge or technology beyond what we can demonstrate through evidence. The precision of Egyptian engineering is remarkable, but experimental archaeology has shown that proposed ancient methods could achieve similar results given sufficient time and labour. The Antikythera mechanism is extraordinary, but it's an outlier. We have no other examples of similar devices from that period, suggesting it was exceptional rather than representative of general technological capabilities. The Baghdad battery might have generated current, but that doesn't prove systematic understanding of electricity. It could be coincidental electrochemistry from a device designed for different purposes. The mainstream position isn't that ancient people were primitive, it's that we need solid evidence before attributing capabilities to them. Speculation should be clearly identified as such, rather than presented as fact. Regarding Indigenous history, the Smithsonian has acknowledged past failures to adequately recognise and display pre-Columbian achievements. Modern exhibits have corrected this. Collaborative programs with tribal nations have expanded. Indigenous voices are increasingly centred in interpretation of their own histories. These changes demonstrate institutional willingness to evolve and acknowledge past shortcomings. They show the Smithsonian responding to legitimate criticism. But conspiracy theorists interpret even these positive changes differently. They see them as admissions that evidence was previously suppressed. If the institution now acknowledges greater indigenous sophistication, doesn't that prove they were downplaying it before? The Smithsonian's response: understanding evolves. New research produces new insights. Changing interpretations reflects scientific progress, not previous conspiracy. When confronted with whistleblower accounts, the institution cannot respond to unverified, anonymous claims. If someone has evidence of wrongdoing, they should present it through proper channels. Anonymous forum posts prove nothing. The overall Smithsonian position boils down to science is a process. Our understanding of the past is constantly being refined. Mistakes have been made and corrected, but there is no systematic effort to hide evidence or suppress truth. Archaeologists argue that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If someone claims 10-foot-tall humans once lived in North America, we need more than newspaper clippings. We need bones, measurements, DNA analysis, and contextual evidence. If someone claims ancient Americans had advanced technology far beyond what we currently understand, we need artifacts that cannot be explained through known capabilities. Absence of such evidence, despite extensive archaeological work across the Americas, suggests the claims are unfounded. But for conspiracy theorists, official denials only deepen suspicion. Of course, the institution would deny wrongdoing. What else would they say? This is the impossible position institutions face when accused of conspiracy. Evidence of innocence can be dismissed as cover-up. Lack of evidence for conspiracy can be explained as successful concealment. The argument becomes unfalsifiable, and unfalsifiable claims aren't science, they're faith. Chapter 9. Why the Theory Endures. The Smithsonian conspiracy theory persists not primarily because of evidence, but because of context, because of how it fits into broader patterns of institutional distrust, because of how it answers uncomfortable questions, because it offers simple explanations for complex realities. Several factors ensure the theory's continued vitality despite lack of proof. First, early American archaeology did lack standards. This is historical fact. Before professional archaeology developed as a discipline in the early 20th century, excavation techniques were crude. Documentation was inconsistent or non-existent. Amateur enthusiasts conducted digs with no scientific training. Farmers unearthed burial mounds looking for valuables. Collectors hired labourers to dig for artefacts without recording context. Newspapers reported sensational finds without verification. This chaotic early period created a documentary record full of questionable claims, exaggerations, and outright frauds. Some of this material is now recognisable as false, but some sits in an ambiguous zone where we can neither prove nor disprove the claims. That ambiguity breeds speculation. If we can't definitively say certain reports were wrong, maybe they were right. And if they were right, where did the evidence go? Second, museums historically did make mistakes. They displayed forgeries. They supported incorrect theories. They made claims that later proved embarrassing. The Smithsonian exhibited the Cardiff Giant before it was proven to be a hoax. The institution supported now discredited theories about human evolution. It displayed archaeological interpretations that subsequent research contradicted. These are actually signs that science works through self-correction. They demonstrate that institutions can admit error and update positions. But they also demonstrate fallibility. And once people realise an authority can be wrong, every claim becomes potentially questionable. Third, real cover-ups have occurred in other contexts, fueling generalised distrust. Governments have hidden information about military experiments, environmental contamination, and public health risks. Corporations have suppressed research about product safety. Scientific institutions have at times been slow to acknowledge findings that challenged powerful interests. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, tobacco industry research manipulation, pharmaceutical companies hiding adverse trial results. These proven conspiracies establish that institutions can and do conceal truth when motivated to do so. So when conspiracy theorists look at the Smithsonian, they reason, if cover-ups happen in medicine and industry and government, why not in archaeology? What makes museums immune to the same pressures? Fourth, genuine mysteries remain unsolved. Ancient engineering feats we don't fully understand, artifacts that don't fit neatly into established timelines, cultural achievements that seem advanced for their supposed technological context. Mainstream archaeology offers explanations, but they sometimes feel incomplete. They require imagining capabilities we can't quite reconstruct. They involve lost techniques we can only theorize about. In that gap between achievement and explanation, conspiracy theories flourish. If we don't know exactly how they did it, maybe they had help we're not acknowledging. Maybe evidence of that help has been suppressed. Fifth, the absence of proof becomes part of the narrative. If the Smithsonian isn't hiding anything, conspiracy theorists ask, why can't they produce the giant skeletons mentioned in those newspaper accounts? Why aren't the artifacts from old expedition reports available for study? The official answer is reasonable. The items probably never existed as described, or they were destroyed through ordinary causes, or they're simply lost in vast, imperfectly organised collections. But conspiracy theorists here, they existed, and someone made them disappear. This is the insidious logic of conspiracy thinking. Any gap in the record becomes potential evidence. Any missing data suggests intentional concealment. Absence of proof is reframed as proof of absence. Sixth, the theory is emotionally satisfying. It provides simple answers to complex questions. It creates villains and heroes. It suggests that truth is being suppressed but can be recovered through persistent investigation. It's more comfortable to believe in conspiracy than to accept that. Much of the past is genuinely unknowable. Documentary evidence is often unreliable. Our understanding is incomplete and uncertain. Some mysteries may never be solved. Conspiracy offers certainty. It says, we would know the truth if they hadn't hidden it. The knowledge exists, just concealed. This is psychologically easier than accepting fundamental uncertainty. Seventh, the internet has amplified and preserved conspiracy claims, while making authoritative rebuttals seem like just another opinion. Before the internet, conspiracy theories spread through books and word of mouth. They faced gatekeepers, publishers, librarians, educators who could evaluate credibility. Now, a blog post claiming Smithsonian cover-ups has the same accessibility as an official institutional statement, actually often more accessibility because conspiracy content is engineered for engagement while official responses are written in careful academic language. Search algorithms can't evaluate truth. They evaluate popularity and relevance. If thousands of people share a conspiracy claim, it rises in search results regardless of accuracy. Young people researching topics for school and counter-conspiracy websites alongside authoritative sources. Without training in source evaluation, how do they distinguish between them? Eighth, the conspiracy theory serves political and ideological purposes for some believers. For those who reject mainstream science on religious grounds, evidence that scientific authorities are unreliable supports their worldview. If the Smithsonian hides giant skeletons mentioned in the Bible, this confirms that secular science cannot be trusted. For those who oppose government and federal institutions on principle, the Smithsonian as a federal entity makes an appealing target. Proving federal dishonesty in one area justifies distrust in all areas. For those who feel marginalised by academic culture, conspiracy theories offer a way to claim superior knowledge. I know the truth that experts hide. These motivations ensure the theory's persistence regardless of evidence. The tragedy is that some legitimate questions get lost in conspiracy noise. Questions about how curatorial decisions are made and whether they involve unconscious bias. How institutional culture affects which research questions receive attention and resources. How gaps in historical knowledge should be acknowledged and communicated. How to balance certainty and uncertainty in public education. These are important questions worthy of serious discussion, but they get overshadowed by claims of deliberate deception and hidden giants. The Smithsonian conspiracy theory endures because it offers what humans crave: simple explanations, clear villains, and the promise that truth is just hidden, not genuinely unknown. Reality is messier, truth is harder. Chapter 10. Truth, Trust, and Institutions. Strip away the allegations about giants and lost civilizations. Remove the claims of destroyed evidence and hidden artifacts. What remains is a deeper, more fundamental question that the conspiracy theories dance around without directly addressing. Who do we trust to tell history? And what happens when that trust proves conditional? The Smithsonian Institution shapes how millions of Americans understand the past. Its exhibits become common knowledge, the background facts that educated people are expected to know. Its publications influence textbooks that shape what children learn. Its researchers appear in documentaries, offering expert testimony that carries the weight of institutional authority. This is enormous power. Power to define what is important and what is trivial,